I can teach you how to bewitch the mind and ensnare the senses. I can tell you how to bottle fame, brew glory, and even put a stopper in death.
Welcome to Snape Chat, the voice of the Snapedom, the podcast where we discuss all things Snape, always. Join us as we dive into the world of the bravest man we ever knew in art, fanfic, meta, and more, obviously. This is Snapecentric with episode 37, the Snirthday celebration for 2024. I'm joined by Megs, Masao, and arabellawrites as we listen to 7 great Snapey stories by paracosim, Arrisha, senlinyu, Perverse Idol, Lexin, Icarus, and arabellawrites. These are read by paracosim, Purup, Snape Snail Tape, Perverse Idol, Masao, Inspirapens, and myself. It's another Mondo-sized show with a lot of variety. This includes some works that are not safe for work, starting at about the hour 40-minute point. So save those for the commute home. Enjoy the show. This is Snapecentric, and I'm here with Megs.
Hello.
Masao.
Hi there.
And arabellawrites, who's on silent, just sharing chat with us. And we're getting together to celebrate Snape's 64th birthday.
Wow, 64.
I know, I can't believe it. It's lies.
Yeah, I know just how he feels, except for having that big sucking snake wound.
Yeah. I just realized he's the same age as my dad.
He is 64. He's 10 years older than my parents.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, wow. You know I'm 60, right?
Yeah.
You hit 60?
I'm 60.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I did know that.
That's why I have such a hard time. I'm a boomer.
That's okay.
So technical things they're a real challenge for me.
A very cool boomer, though.
Yeah.
Oh,
You've been doing pretty dang good. I will say that.
So I've gotten us a really nice variety of fics to listen to. Or starting with some Jen Severitis, I think was one way to pronounce it.
However you would like to pronounce it. I think at this point everyone has
Yeah.
It's one of those things you only see in text until you have to say it out loud. You're just like,
right.
What?
What is this? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this is probably one of the best ones out there. We're going to be reading from That Awful Boy by paracosim, read by the author, read by him.
And these are excerpts, right? Like we're reading specific chapters.
Mostly they're excerpts.
Yeah.
This is chapter 3, That Awful Boy by paracosim.
Harry's first impression of Cokeworth was one of familiarity, of cold tinned tomatoes on equally cold toast and damp, musty bed sheets. He'd been here before, or at least somewhere near to it, back before Hogwarts. They'd stayed at a hotel around the area when Uncle Vernon had taken them all on the run from the letters. Had Snape really been so close all that time? Close enough that they might have run into each other at the corner store in town, or passed each other by on the street? His second impression was one of vague concern. The section of Cokeworth Lupin had apparated them to had been distinctly shabby in a way that Little Whinging had never been. But as they traveled further on, past the town and past the little houses and playgrounds, themes seemed to go from shabby to derelict. The river had seemed to be the dividing marker. It snaked by the outskirts of the neat little family homes Harry had caught a glimpse of, trash-logged and turned brown with filth. In the distance, he could see the top of an old factory chimney looming high above the abandoned workers' two-up, two-downs that made up the side of the town he'd had the misfortune to find himself in. Snape lived here? Harry, Lupin murmured, grazing his shoulder with a barely there touch. Try to keep close. We still have a ways to go. He didn't want to know how bad the state of the houses even further in were. Had Cokeworth somehow gone untouched by the slum clearance in the 1950s and 60s? The windows of nearly every house they passed were either boarded, shattered, or both. Some buildings were missing their doors. Any house they passed by with lights on inside seemed hardly better than the rest. Harry felt as though he'd stepped into a frozen passage of time, a relic that had been forgotten by the rest of the world and left to rot alone. Here we are. The words were so soft, Harry barely heard them. They'd come to a stop deep within the maze of narrow cobbled streets, in front of a house that should have been demolished 40 years prior. When Lupin raised a hand to rap on the door, Harry felt suddenly as though the hot, dirty air was suffocating him, filling his lungs until they became leaden. It was hard to breathe. Not wanting Professor Lupin to see the panic crushing his sternum, he fixed his eyes on his trainers, tracing the line where they were beginning to tear at the uppers. The door opened. He felt his heart jolt at the sound of it. I don't suppose you might just be muggles hoping to promote the Lord, Severus Snape said flatly. Harry snatched the briefest glimpse of him from where he was leaning out the door before he locked eyes back onto his shoelaces. Hello, Severus, Lupin said through his beard, glancing down the empty street. Well, are you coming in? Harry stepped into the house before his courage could fail him. The rancid smell of the river didn't last past the doorway. Snape's house smelled old, dusty, with the lingering sharpness of stale cigarettes and black coffee. He took a deep breath to fortify himself and looked around. The expected green and silver color scheme was nowhere to be seen. The living room looked like a prison cell, with bookshelves for cages, and the scant amount of furniture was ratty, with dull, threadbare fabrics that would have been considered old 20 years ago. The only source of light was a candle-filled lamp hanging from the ceiling. Harry had expected luxury, silks and satins with a horde of house elves. Wasn't Snape a rich pureblood? Wasn't there supposed to be a fine shaved lounge instead of a sagging sofa? A leather armchair not unlike those in Slytherin common rooms, to replace the ancient monstrosity by the hearth? He'd never paid close enough attention to his potions professor to truly study him, but hadn't he always worn fine, if not drab robes? Or had he simply not noticed the fraying sleeves and aged patches he now saw clearly as though they had appeared out of nothingness? The room itself seemed to be made up of books. They were everywhere, on shelves, in cases, stacked on the floor and footstool, and even piled in a tattered armchair. Snape had a miniature library in his house. It was the only part of this relic of a home that had fit Harry's previously assumed impression of the man. Then he remembered he didn't actually give a damn what his impressions of this place or its owner were, because fury had swiftly overtaken him at the dismissive look on Snape's face, and suddenly he was shouting. I've been stuck at the Dursleys for a month, and I've handled more than the others ever managed, and Dumbledore knows it. Who saved the Sorcerer's Stone? Who got rid of Riddle? Who saved Ron and Hermione's skins from Dementors? Who? There was no worldly payment Dumbledore could ever have given him that would make any of this worth it. As Potter continued spewing what was likely a year's worth of adolescent frustrations, he retired to the kitchen to begin meal prep. The boy didn't even seem to notice he'd left the room. His temper likely wouldn't simmer down once he did notice. If somebody simply walked away while he was in the middle of a passionate rant, Severus would find himself none too pleased. Then again, it wasn't as if he cared about Potter's fragile ego. In the living room, the wolf was speaking in a low, soothing tone. The boy had stopped shouting, but Severus knew perfectly well it hadn't cured anything. Teenagers rarely expended all their hurts in one go. To expect attitude during these hellish weeks would be an understatement. And to think he had to teach someone like this how to control their emotions. Someone so arrogant, so open and emotionally vulnerable that wore their heart on their sleeve, just like his father. Supper was ready to be prepared by the time Lupin led the boy into the kitchen. He cast a withering look at them both as they began to look around. They were studying the room closely without even attempting to be discreet about it. Gryffindors. Listen closely, Potter, he said, injecting as much sneer into the words as possible. I am not made of money. Do not expect to be living in luxury during your stay here. I refuse to allow you to lounge about all day, throwing your weight around my house, and expecting to be treated like royalty. There will be chores. You will be finishing your summer homework to my satisfaction, and you will be studying all that I attempt to force into your minuscule brain. There was a sullen silence from behind him. Then, softly, all right. What was that? Yes, sir. Severus heard a faint sigh from somewhere to his left. Turning his head slightly to watch the wolf creep closer, he snapped, Do you need something, Lupin? I'd like to thank you for agreeing to take in Harry, teach him clemency. The order is indebted to you, Severus, he said, for all the world seeming like he truly meant it. He was currently studying the broken handle on his silverware drawer and the dishes in the sink, with an air of vague interest. The light on the ceiling flickered ominously. Severus shot a glare at it, daring it to go out during the inspection of his home. Your appreciation is neither wanted nor needed, he dismissed, mincing the remnants of the parsley he'd found in his fridge and reaching for his Ziploc bag of diced white onion. Lupin hadn't stopped moving. He was uncomfortably close now. Goosebumps prickled along his arms at the proximity. Why are you coming closer? Trying to make sure I don't poison the boy who lived? Rest assured, werewolf, I'm currently out of my quickest poisons. Even I would tire of watching Potter writhe on the floor as death slowly overtakes him. Do you want me to help with dinner? Potter suddenly asked. The offer seemed surprisingly sincere, even though it was aimed towards his disgusting trainers. The boy's hands were twisted in his oversized shirt, just as disrespectful as his father. I'm a decent hand at cooking. No, stand quiet. His kitchen was too fucking tiny for this. He could hear the telltale creak as the boy sat down in the chair closest to the back door, and then the sound of him plucking at the stuffing in the ragged seat cushion. What are you making? Lupin asked mildly. It looks quite healthy. Ah. And now the questioning had begun. An Israeli salad. He diced 2 cucumbers with precision born from years of cutting potion ingredients, and pushed the pile aside to make room for a tomato. It joined the growing pile of chopped vegetables in a matter of seconds. Go ahead and begin the interrogation. No need to hide behind polite inquiries. Lupin did just that, firing off questions without preamble. Severus tipped the vegetables in the cutting board into a chipped bowl and grabbed a spoon to toss it all together. Was he going to keep the chosen one fed? Was there a place for him to sleep? Was his house on the verge of condemnation, or was it clean? How safe was that potion bubbling away on his stove? How old were the dishes in the sink? Did he have an outhouse, or was there a more modern bathroom attached to the house itself? Was it reasonably lacking in mildew? Was the whole building this shabby? He twitched at that one. Or was it just a sitting room and kitchen? Was the house itself safe? Were there any dark objects of any kind? Will it ever end? He found himself wondering after the 9th question. The salad was long since finished, and Lupin still hadn't escorted himself out of the door. Did he expect to be invited to eat? There wasn't nearly enough food for the 3 of them. He'd only made enough for Potter, using whatever odds and ends he'd been able to find in the kitchen. There would be a visit to the local shopping center in the very near future. Potter, Severus said, cutting Lupin off and turning to glare at the supposed chosen one. The boy stared back defiantly, gripping the bottom of the chair so hard his knuckles had gone white. He was bouncing one of his legs as though ready to hack someone at a moment's notice. Those oversized clothes were beginning to piss him off, too, and those trainers would be going to the rubbish bin outside at the minute he found a newer pair among the boy's belongings. Lemon juice, olive oil, or tahini? He stopped picking at the chair's stuffing long enough to scratch at his nose. Tahini? Are you asking or saying? He demanded. Saying? The boy said slowly, trying to look up at the salad on the counter without standing. Lupin was smiling wryly at him. Clearly, he found the boy's lack of decision-making skills endearing. Why he was the one being questioned for his ability to take care of a single teenager, he'd never understand. He'd been taking care of a couple hundred of the brats for over a decade now, and none of them had ever been seriously traumatized by him. The most he'd ever done was make a Hufflepuff or 2 cry, and that had been years ago before he'd learned how to toe the line between deflating an Ingo and inducing fits of hysteria. When he opened his refrigerator, Lupin was suddenly there, silently studying the lack of food. I will, of course, be going to the supermarket, said Severus with a curl of his lips. I have no intentions of starving Potter. Glad to hear it, the wolf smiled. Do you have the funds to keep a teenage boy fed? I don't expect to be filing bankruptcy after he leaves your headquarters. Is that a yes? Obviously. Are we finished here? I wouldn't want Potter's healthy meal to wilt, seeing as how you seem to be planning on staying until the end of time. Severus fixed a bland smile on his face, fully aware it hadn't touched his eyes. I believe you've overstayed your welcome. It's time for you to leave. You've never been one to mince words, Severus. Lupin's smile was equally bland. But unfortunately, my visit isn't quite finished. Would you allow me to inspect the upstairs? And for the first time, Severus felt an inkling of true discomfort. The upstairs? The kitchen and living room were one thing, but the upstairs, that was a place he allowed no one to set foot. If you must, he said tonelessly, occluding hard enough to make himself feel numb inside and out. I can assure you, Potter will be spending minimal time upstairs. In fact, the only time he will be up there at all is if he has somehow injured himself and needs my assistance during the night. Lupin paused and looked around. Is there a bedroom on the ground floor that he'll be sleeping in? Potter had stopped eating, Severus noticed, with his mouth full of food and his head down. The spare bedroom upstairs has been a storage room for some time now, and isn't currently fit for human consumption. Until I can find the time necessary to clean it out, the boy will be sleeping on the sofa. It is not uncomfortable. I will, of course, be adding copious cushioning charms to it and blankets. It will be far from the beds he's no doubt used to, but it isn't a box on the side of the road. I'm glad to hear of it. The werewolf's expression was inscrutable, body language loose and relaxed from where he leaned slightly against the counter, illuminated by a halo in the gray light streaming into the dirty window. It infuriated him, really, that he couldn't use legitimacy on werewolves. He would love to be able to crack open that mild-mannered composure and see what sort of twistedness lay within the mind of Lupin. Reading body language wasn't difficult. It was easy, really, a talent developed early in life. But while James Potter and Sirius Black had always been open books, Remus Lupin had been another story entirely. And Severus hated closed books. Come along, then, he snapped, sweeping out of the kitchen without so much of a backward glance to ensure the werewolf was following. The sound of footsteps was enough indication. He crossed the sitting room in a few strides, pausing only long enough to pull out the book that would trigger the shelf to jump aside before he began the ascent up the narrow staircase. It was barely a moment later that he realized Lupin wasn't going to be able to follow him up the death trap that posed as a flight of stairs. Don't follow me, Wolf. You'll break his worthless neck. I'll fetch you. As loath as he was to touch anyone, let alone the specific anyone, Severus knew Albus would string him up by his toes and flay him alive if he were to allow his precious werewolf to break his neck on the stairs. And so he grabbed the men roughly by the arm and marched them up to the second floor. He could feel the very cells in his body cringing away from the contact. The hairs in the back of his neck were prickling. These stairs seem very dangerous, said Lupin. He seemed to be taking the rough treatment in stride, glancing about in a show of polite interest. They reached the top of the landing without incident. The moment he was certain the wolf wouldn't fall, Severus pulled away sharply and stepped to the side. Is there not a banister or a light? He'd broken his arm in the summer before 70, or falling down these stairs. All stairs are dangerous if you're an insufferable dunderhead who can't be arsed to follow basic safety procedures. A proper banister would most certainly follow basic safety procedures. He'd forgotten what a vindictive cunt Remus Lupin could be when he felt like it. A mix of hatred and vague nostalgia swelled up in him, churning together to resemble something like indigestion. Is this enough inspection, Lupin? He hissed, wishing desperately to hex the man and be done with it. He swept an arm out in a parody of showing, movement nearly lost in the darkness of the landing. Will you not be satisfied until you've taken notes to bring back to black? Would you like a camera as well? Just as he'd hoped, Lupin's composure finally cracked. There was a sharp crease between his eyebrows, and his eyes seemed tight. Irritably, he said, That's not my intention, Severus. I only wish to ensure Harry's safety and comfort during his stay. Making a fool of you is by no means the purpose of my coming here. Now, may I see these rooms? Severus was going to need a calming draught the minute this farce of a home inspection was complete. What was this? A raid on Malfoy Manor? Wrenching the door closest to the stairs open, he stepped back protectively in front of the room that was once his parents' and jerked his head at his own bedroom. There, he snapped. Do try to restrain yourself from disturbing anything. It was times like these where he was rather glad he didn't own much in the way of furniture or clothing. His bedroom was bare to the point of looking almost entirely uninhabited, a guest room, void of personality and decoration. The bedstead was iron, with thin sheets coated in an even thinner layer of dust. One of the legs in the wardrobe was too short. It wobbled every time he opened it. His nightstand was chipped and worn, and the lamp on top was even dustier than its bedsheets. Is this not your room? Lupin asked, glancing about. It looks quite neglected. What an astute observation. One might think you do, in fact, possess more than one brain cell. I've been away, if you must know, though I would love for you to enlighten me how it is any of your business. He lied smoothly. The sofa is where he normally kept down. Yet another thing Potter was going to ruin during his brief stint at Spinner's End. Is that all? My patience is running very thin. Lupin did not mention the other bedroom. Severus didn't make any attempt at reminding him of it. The returning trek down the stairs was slower than the first because Severus knew from experience just how dangerous said trek could be, and by the end of it his fingers felt stiff from how tightly he clenched the other shirt in his fist. They returned to the kitchen without a word. Potter didn't move when they entered, but Severus could see his eyes dart up to scrutinize them before returning to the remnants of his dinner. The wolf looked round once more, finally nodded a little. Harry, the boy said, shut up. I'll be seeing you in 2 days, and you will have full access to the flu network while here in case of an emergency. I'm sure Ron and Hermione are writing frantic letters to you as we speak. Do you need anything before I leave? No, I think I'm okay, the boy mumbled, shuffling upright in his chair from the slouch he had slumped into. Oh, wait, could you unstring my trunk, actually? Severus busied himself with preparing more potion ingredients. He wouldn't have to look directly at either of them. He could hear the wheels in Potter's trunk grate against his kitchen floor. Well, I'll be off then. Lupin hesitantly placed a hand on Potter's shoulder, like he was afraid of spreading his werewolf, and briefly exchanged goodbyes. I'll be here around Friday afternoon. Thank you again for this, Severus. Harry, I'll be seeing you. I'll go ahead and see myself out. When the front door finally closed, and Lupin was finally gone, Severus deigned himself to look at the boy. Now that your favorite werewolf has finished poking his snout into places it doesn't belong, and you're quite finished, you can go find something quiet to do. You have a summer assignment in my class. I would suggest you use that as a method to staying out of my way. Potter glowered at his fork and made no move to get up. He's only trying to help, sir. Be that as it may, Lupin can feel free to help elsewhere and stay far away from my house, preferably forever. But he supposed you couldn't always get what he wanted in life. If he could, the Marauders would have died many years ago, and he wouldn't have had the spawn of all his least favorite classmates foisted upon him. But then he'd likely still be with the Dark Lord if that was true, killing innocent people, making deadly poisons, and generally making a nuisance of himself in trying to impress his fellow Death Eaters. Are you finished eating? As I said, you won't be throwing your weight around my house. Scrape your plate and place it in the sink. Do, do you want me to do the washing up too, sir? His voice was sullen. No, we aren't muggles. Silence. But then, just as angrily, it was good. Thank you for the food. If he was going to insist on being like this all year, Severus was going to end up killing himself by November. Had he really agreed to this? Had Albus perhaps hit him with a subtle compulsion charm, or had he potentially been putting compliance potions into his coffee grounds the last year? Maybe he'd been under the Imperius when he said yes. He'd only just begun to open his mouth and fuck up whatever tentative truce they seemed to have formed when the oven timer chimed. The Veritasium was in his third stage. Jolting towards the stove, he rushed to begin chopping bitter root, holding his breath to keep the rancid smell out. The boy made a gagging noise from behind him and demanded, "What the hell is that?" Bitter root, as he should have known since second year. Cover your nose. I won't have you sucking up all over my table. It was all in now, and he allowed himself the few seconds that it took to cast an air-freshening spell before reaching for a supply of jobberknoll feathers and dropping a single one into the brew and turning the heat on the highest setting. His stove let out a furious rumble and flickered ominously but held steady. He'd chosen the good burner for a reason. Summer assignment, Potter. I shan't repeat myself again. Dropping a measure of Molly into the potion, Severus stirred counterclockwise for 12 seconds before turning clockwise for another 5, and then counter again until the potion turned neon green, the final stage before it became colorless and had to stew for a week. He was not looking forward to the gas bill. He mopped at his forehead with one hand and cast a cooling charm with the other before beginning to measure out a teaspoon of powdered moonstone. Have you begun to complete any of your summer assignments? He asked as he stirred in alternating turns. Potter didn't reply, but the split seconds pause before he continued paging through his potions book was enough of an answer. I shouldn't have expected anything less. So arrogant. You're pushing your first year, and yet you are still expecting to glide your way through school on fame alone, rather than hard work. How will you ever hope to pass your owls? Will you dazzle them with your scar and ask for an O? He went on, turning his stove down low as the grain suddenly sapped away, leaving behind a concoction that resembled water. Finally. And now all he needed to do was make sure the boy didn't touch it. Now, we have some rules to be going over. Harry had been waiting for the rules. He was still seething by the time Snape finished the potion, and he knew full well that his temper was only going to become worse when the Git would present him with what was sure to be a book as thick as his head, full of rules like, do not look at me when the hour is a number divisible by 2, and refrain from bringing garlic into the premise of my property lest I disembowel you and use your innards in a potion to power the Dark Lord. Rules, sir? He said in a voice he hoped to be reasonably calm, arranging his expression into something he thought might be politely quizzical. Snape pivoted on his heel and fixed him with a baleful look, but said nothing. There was an air about him that reminded Harry of the one that often radiated from him like an aura during potions. The one that said he was such a miserable failure, there weren't even words to describe how much of a mistake his parents had made in conceiving him. Apparently, his politely quizzical face was just as bad as his innocent one. Yes, Potter, said Snape with relish. Rules. You will follow them all unless you'd like to scrub up my used cauldrons all summer. Do you enjoy the smell of week-old polyjuice crustings? Polyjuice crustings? It had been 3 years since his adventure into the Slytherin common room, but the mere memory of cleaning that cauldron made him gag a little. Or maybe it was the remnants of the nausea that had sprung up when Snape cut open the bitter root. Would you like me to go fetch a quill, Professor? Harry asked. How long should my parchment be? Will 12 inches do? What little he could see of Snape's eyes behind the greasy hair looked hard and cold. Are you offering to begin lines? Are you planning on breaking rules, are you? That awful boy. He swallowed. No. No? No, sir. Those black eyes went even colder. Spare me your lies. He moved suddenly, planting both hands down the table so he was staring down his considerable nose at Harry. Rule 1. You will not, for any reason, touch the cauldron on the stove. You will not add anything to it. You will not move it aside. You will not turn the stove off. You will not breathe on it. Do not touch the potion, and our weeks together will pass quite smoothly. Rule 2. You will not enter either of the upstairs rooms for any reason. I don't care if you have an excuse that would satisfy the Dark Lord himself. You will not enter those rooms. Rule 3. He was wrong, Harry thought, as Snape prattled on and on. 12 inches wouldn't be nearly enough to write all of this down.
Okay. That was That Awful Boy by paracosim. I think a really good characterization of Snape and his crappy attitude.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also a really good characterization of his living space and how his living space reflects him as a person. You know, it simultaneously shocks Harry, but to us, the readers, it really shows a part of Snape that we know that Harry doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think it's, even though he's protesting about taking care of the boy, he goes ahead and makes him a nice salad.
Yeah.
Just, without any real prompting.
And gives up, well, this is my impression. He gives up the place he prefers sleeping to Harry, and now he's gonna have to take his own like bedroom that he hasn't bothered with.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. Like when you're like obsessively working on stuff, you don't want to have to like go to a completely different part of the house. You just want to like fall over and go to sleep like amongst your work.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure. I don't know if either of you have read this fic, That Awful Boy, but it turns into a little bit of snooping.
Oh, I do like that.
It's really awkward and
Oh, I love awkward.
slow burny and
I love awkward.
yeah, so good. And this is a complete fic followed by the Pauper Prince, I think is the name of the follow-up. Anyway, good stuff. Highly recommend. We'll go along to Snary.
Oh boy.
Yeah. This is by Arrisha, who's done some really interesting stories with Snary.
I literally just finished reading this.
Uh-huh.
Like I wasn't even aware that this was going to be featured on here. And so, yeah, I just thought it was really funny. This is a really interesting chapter choice. So I'm excited to get
Mhm.
into
All I can say is it's bananas.
Yeah, I literally, it's like the most chaotic thing.
Yeah. Arrisha says that this is probably the funniest thing she's ever written. So, and I was like, funny. It is in kind of a dark way.
Yeah. Probably like funny from the aspect of how out of character everyone is in that moment. Like it's just,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. I got to do a bit of setup because the segment is from chapter 5. So
Mm-hmm.
we've gone into it a little bit. So basically, Harry finds himself in a world without magic. He lives with his aging grandfather, Voldemort, and works with Hermione. She doesn't know anything about magic. And when he tries to tell her, she'll come back the next day, not remembering what he said or even remembering him at all. It's like she's been obliviated. Eventually, he finds Snape and also cannot tell him about magic without him forgetting about it. He decides that he's going to basically hold Snape at gunpoint to get him to stay in one place at his house, telling him about magic and waiting to see what happens.
Oh, fantastic.
So, yeah,
Is this read by the author or?
this is read by Pirip.
Oh, my own boyfriend.
Yes. So, Riddle of the Midnight Sky by Arrisha, read by Pirip.
Riddle of the Midnight Sky by Arrisha, from Chapter 5, Brentford. You can lower your arms, I'm not going to shoot you. Snape seemed hesitant. Just lower your arms, Harry snapped. Snape rubbed his arms at once, sighing heavily as he leaned forward and rubbed his neck and face. He winced in pain. I'm sorry for putting you through this, Harry admitted. I really hate what is happening right now. I know how it looks, but it's the only way. He glanced at the clock. In 19 hours, we're leaving. It was 8 o'clock already. The sun was setting behind the clouds as the night began to take form. 24 hours is a guess, Voldemort said. The Obliviator could be watching. He could be waiting for us to leave before showing himself. Still leaning forward, Snape pressed his hands to his ears like he couldn't bear to listen to them anymore. Harry shook his head. I was thinking about that. I don't think so. He licked his lips, trying to put his thoughts into words. The pattern he follows has never changed. They don't forget at night, as I thought. Both Hermione and Snape, they forget when they're left alone. Neither has ever maintained memories related to magic for more than 24 hours. Whoever's doing this somehow knows that Snape's been told, so he's going to come looking for him, to obliviate him, and it's going to happen before 24 hours have passed. Or he might wait. Then we'll wait too. You said 24 hours? Snape said, eyes darting from Harry to Voldemort. Are you planning on staying longer than that? How long exactly will I be kept hostage for? What the hell is an obliviator? Why are you doing this? Control yourself, Severus. This is equally embarrassing for everyone involved. Voldemort clasped his hands on his lap. I'd like a pillow, Harry. Snape threw a pillow at him with all his might. It sent Voldemort's chair several inches back. Why are you doing this? Hey, Harry stood up, pointing the gun at him. Stop. No, you stop. You stop and leave. Or what? What are you going to do? That's right, so sit there and shut up for a bit. You're both clinically insane. You're going to kill me for nothing. For a fantasy. I don't know you, or him, or your stupid fucking mother. Harry crossed the distance between them so fast, Snape released a surprised gasp and shut his eyes so tightly that tears squeezed out. Do not talk about my mother, Harry said coldly. He looked at the gun barely an inch away from Snape's head, and for a fleeting instant he found himself mesmerized by his own anger. He didn't think he'd be capable of this. Darkness uncoiled inside him, violent and cold. Do not talk about her. Snape nodded his head frantically, not daring to utter a single word. He was helpless, scared and defenseless, like a child. You will never cease to surprise me, Harry Potter, Voldemort said. Harry blinked. There were tears in his eyes. He looked at Voldemort, who smiled as if he'd just won a personal bet. He looked happy. He looked pleased, and Harry felt sick to his stomach and utterly crushed. He lowered the gun. I'm sorry, he muttered, but Snape was petrified, eyes still closed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He walked away from Snape, collapsing back onto the chair, holding his head. He glanced at the clock. 8:23 p.m. They wouldn't make it. Harry would break down first, or Snape would, or both. Harry dreaded to think what would happen if Voldemort somehow ended up in control of the gun. He took a couple of deep breaths and straightened up. Snape was looking at him. He was gripping the edge of the cushions with both hands, his knuckles white. Are you hungry? Harry asked him. I'm quite thirsty, Voldemort answered. Harry jerked his head dismissively. Snape, and you? Snape nodded. All right. Harry wiped his face and stood. Have you got a kitchen? Snape nodded again. Let's go. You're staying here, he told Voldemort. No, Harry. Yes, come. I will not accept to... I need a fucking break from you, Harry hissed so hatefully that spittle flew from his mouth. Come. Harry took Snape to the kitchen, down to the end of the corridor, and went to the fridge right away. Sit down, he told Snape. Hands on the table, hands flat on the table, that's it. After a moment, Harry spotted a bottle of orange juice behind Snape's vegetables, and nearly moaned. He gulped it down as if he hadn't had any liquids in weeks. Fuck, he whispered, closing his eyes. Do you want? He showed Snape the juice. Snape shook his head. No, thank you. Harry turned his attention back to the fridge, which, apart from the vegetables and the juice, was completely empty. Do you not eat? I was planning on going grocery shopping today, but I was unfortunately kidnapped before I had the chance to. Harry made a face. I haven't kidnapped you. Am I free to leave then? No. Harry had never had less of an appetite, but he knew he had to eat if he intended to stay vigilant for the next 19 hours. He searched Snape's cupboards methodically, but the only quick meal he was able to find was 2 cans of beans. Better than nothing, he supposed. Where are your spoons? I'll get you one. So you can go where the knives are? Harry smiled. I'm not stupid. He found the spoons himself and sat across Snape on the table, passing him one of the cans. Eat. Snape looked at the beans the way one would look at rotten cabbage. I'm not as hungry as I thought, he said. Suit yourself. Now that most of Harry's panic was gone, it seemed that his new normal was all there ever was, like Harry had somehow been in this house since the beginning of time, with Snape as his prisoner, eating cold canned beans and holding a gun while Snape watched him in silence. He realized he was touching his neck on that spot again, and he forced his hand down. Every day I do my absolute best to be a good person, you know, he said quietly. I try to take care of Tom, to let go of my hatred for him. I try to forgive him. I try to be a good friend to Hermione. I try to move on. I try to appreciate what I have. I don't like that I'm doing this to you. I hate it. It's not too late to... No, don't. I'm not backing down. I'm just telling you I hate it. That's all. Consider it small talk. Snape's kitchen was cozy, with floral curtains on the window and old-fashioned wallpaper covering the walls. Harry spotted Snape's mailbag on the countertop next to a pile of books, a textbook, and a teapot. A used mug was placed inside the sink. "Did you have tea last night?" "No." "And that?" Harry pointed at the mug. "It's from the day before." "If you're sure," Harry bit his cheek. "I like your house," he went on after swallowing his mouthful of beans. "It's not a palace, but it's nice. Pretty snug." "Thank you," Snape replied stiffly. A minute passed in silence, then Snape added, "You said I died. Is this how you're planning to end this?" Harry couldn't look at him. "Do you really think I could kill you? You've had me at gunpoint for hours now." "I'd never hurt you." Snape smiled at him sadly. He licked his lips as though searching for the right words. "I wanted to be a wizard when I was a kid," he said. Harry was slightly taken aback. "Really? Who doesn't? It's every child's dream. I used to play with sticks pretending they're wands." "Did you want to see a real wand?" Before Snape could answer, Harry took off his backpack and unzipped it, taking out the Elder Wand. "Here." He placed it on the table, prompting Snape to pick it up. After a moment, Snape reached to take it. He moved it around in his hands, observing the carved handle closely. "Is this your wand?" "This was Dumbledore's. He was the headmaster at my school." "It's very pretty." "I know. It used to be powerful." "Harry, who do you think I am exactly?" "I know you're not the Snape I used to know," Harry replied. "But you're a Snape, and you're alive, and I want to know why they're altering your memories." "No one is altering my memories. This," he looked at the wand, "this is beautiful, but it isn't a wand, it's just a toy. No one cares for my memories." "No, I do," Harry insisted. "I care about your memories, and that's why I'm doing this." After Harry finished his beans and juice, he led Snape back to the living room. Voldemort had fallen asleep on his chair again, his head unnaturally bent to the side. Harry picked up the pillow Snape had thrown at him and gently placed it behind Voldemort's back. Voldemort opened his eyes. "Harry?" "It's 9 o'clock," Harry said. 18 hours to go. Voldemort made a sound that could have been a whine. "Your head is fucked," Harry muttered, hesitantly placing a finger on Voldemort's swollen forehead. "Does it hurt?" "My back hurts." "Would you like to lie down?" Yes. Carefully, Harry lifted him up and guided him to the sofa, helping him lie down. Snape had scooted to the corner as far away as he could from both of them. "Sleep," Harry said. "It'll be a long night. You too, Severus." "Listen to the boy, Severus. This day has already lasted, forever." Voldemort was fast asleep before he could finish his sentence. Harry was just as exhausted, but he had to stay awake, no matter what. He needed a distraction. "Do you want to watch something?" he asked, picking up the TV remote. "I would like to have my house back to myself," Snape informed him. "Soon." Harry flipped through the channels until he found an old black and white movie. He raised the volume a bit and slumped down on the armchair. "What kind of movies do you like?" Voldemort jerked in his sleep, kicking Snape's thigh. Snape rubbed his face. "Harry, please leave." "In 18 hours. My mother will be devastated. I'm not going to hurt you, Severus." 2 movies and another trip to the bathroom later, Snape succumbed to his burnout and fell asleep too. 14 hours to go. Harry wondered whether all of this was a test. He didn't understand the lesson he was supposed to be learning. Harry bolted up, panicked, looking for the gun. He could hardly recall falling asleep, but now here he was, curled up in Snape's armchair with his muscles hurting and his head foggy. He'd never felt more tired in his entire life. Leaning down, he felt the carpet with his hands until he located the gun next to his backpack. "Thank God," he murmured, rushing to switch on the light. "Snape, wake up." Snape's eyes snapped open. He was leaning on Voldemort's legs, and for a moment he looked disoriented. At the sight of the gun, he sat upright. "Do you remember who I am?" "What?" "What's my name? Speak up." Snape blinked fast. "Your name is Harry," he said, now wide awake. Harry released his breath. "Fuck." He rubbed his face with his forearm. Good. "Will you let me go now?" Harry shook his head. It was only 2. He couldn't believe he'd slept for nearly an hour. In 13 hours. "You can't continue this." Snape moved his legs as if he were about to get up, but a warning glare from Harry was enough to pin him down. "You have no right doing this to me." "I know." Harry sat back down and took out his phone. There were over 10 messages from Hermione and a handful of missed calls in between. "All is well," Harry texted her. "Don't worry. I'll give you a call when I can. Love you. X." He turned off his phone and put it back in his pocket. "You must let me go." "Shh. You'll wake him," Harry pointed to Voldemort. Snape leaned forward, clutching his hair. "Can you at least stop pointing that gun at me?" Harry hadn't realized he was doing it. It had become a habit after so many hours. "I'm sorry. Please get out of my house, please. My students are very young. They would be broken to hear that something happened to me. Some of them have the most unkind families you can imagine. They rely on me. They rely on my advice and friendship. If you hurt me..." "How many times do I have to tell you that I'm not going to hurt you?" Snape chuckled into his hands. "You're going to kill me. You're going to kill me." "I'm not. I'm being punished. That's what's happening. I'm being punished for letting him down by having what he did happen to me too." Harry did not understand. "What do you mean?" "You don't even know me, you fucking psycho. You just think you do. You're insane. You're deranged. Both you and him. You're mad." 13 hours, all right? Then we'll be gone. I promise. I promise you. 13 fucking hours. 13 more hours like this? And then what? What will you do when no wizards come? When you're forced to watch your delusion collapse, Who will you take your anger out on? I need the bathroom again, by the way, if I happen to be allowed. Is it urgent? Yes. Harry nodded. He was mentally drained and he could barely talk. He wanted this to be over more than Snape could imagine. As he accompanied Snape to the bathroom and back, Harry felt a growing sense of deep, razor-sharp self-disgust. What would his 15-year-old self think of all this? What would that ambitious, energetic young boy have to say to a bitter man with a gun? Nothing. Harry felt like everything that he used to be, everything that he ever represented and chose to believe in, all his ideals, his morals, had perished the moment he dared to point a gun at another person. "May I stand for a bit? If it doesn't disturb your great plan too much?" Snape asked as he cracked his neck and rubbed his thigh. "I've been sitting for hours." "You're angry," Harry commented. Snape stared. "What would you have me be?" "That is enough, Severus." Both Harry and Snape turned to Voldemort, whose eyes were just barely open. "Anger clouds judgment. It distorts truth. It destroys integrity. You taught me that a long time ago." "I have never met you before," Snape said slowly, enunciating every syllable like talking to a deaf person. "Just sit down and wait," Harry begged. "That's all I'm asking of you, a few more hours." Time ticked away excruciatingly slowly after that. Voldemort continued nodding off every half hour or so, only to keep jolting awake at the smallest of sounds. As for Snape, he was quite literally in shambles and looked like a wreck. Greasy strands of hair were plastered to his face, but he made no effort to move them. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and he kept staring at the gun no matter how much Harry tried to distract him with conversation. Harry found it progressively more and more difficult to keep his eyes open, and every time he blinked, the sweet lull of sleep tempted him to just keep them closed for a little longer. He was struggling to focus even on the simplest thoughts, but he needed to make it. He needed to stay awake. He kept telling himself that, until, very suddenly, at 5 o'clock exactly, all of the lights flickered as one. Harry held his breath, sitting absolutely still. Was it his idea, or had the room just become a little bit colder? As soundlessly as he could, he walked to the sofa and lightly shook Voldemort. He covered his mouth with a hand as soon as Voldemort opened his eyes. The light flickered again. Snape was about to say something when a thud was heard from the hall. Voldemort sat up. Snape attempted to stand, but Harry stopped him with a hand on his knee. He shook his head at him quietly. Someone was walking toward them. Heavy boots clicked on the floorboards. A pair at first, and then, almost certainly, a second one. The room filled with light so bright that all three of them turned away. Its heat made Harry's skin prickle in pain, and all he could see was white, white, white. They had come for Snape's memories. They had come to erase what Harry had built, again. Without thinking, Harry raised a gun toward the light and pulled the trigger. Bam! The blaring sound of the gunshot pierced his eardrums, and he flinched. There was little time to think as Harry slid to the floor and tried to scurry away, because several things happened in quick succession and stopped him. Snape, who had jolted up with a shout at the sound of the gunshot, escaped Harry's grip and sprinted away, disappearing into the light. Voldemort, in his attempt to stand, rolled off the couch and fell to the floor, yelling in pain. And, at last, a woman Harry could not see at all yelled, "No, no, not my wand!" The windows shattered. A sequence of absurd spells ricocheted across the room, hitting wall after wall, flying in all directions. One of them landed on the armchair, which, with a loud pop, turned into a hog. Another landed on the floor, instantly causing a patch of wildflowers to spring up. A third one wrapped itself around the chandelier, exploding loudly. The sofa was on fire, and the coffee table had come to life, galloping around in circles. All of the books and notebooks Snape had lying around had been absorbed by a violent tornado that was now charging toward Harry. "Who are you?" Harry shouted. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't think anyone had heard him. Dodging the explosions, Harry looked for Voldemort. He spotted him behind the demented hog, lying down on the floor and panting. Harry quickly crawled to him. "All right?" he asked loudly. A stunning hex landed on Voldemort's chest just as he opened his mouth to respond. His eyes rolled to the back of his head and he stayed still. "No, not now," Harry swore, trying to drag him away. Dodging another stray hex, Harry picked up his backpack from behind a cushion, shoved the gun inside, and continued dragging Voldemort toward the hall. Where had the Obliviators gone? A fracture appeared on the wall with a loud crack. The floorboards splintered and swelled. They had to leave. They would die in here if they didn't escape. The house would crumble down and swallow them whole. Where was Snape? Harry caught a glimpse of him at the other end of the living room, crouched in a corner next to the window. He looked hysteric, hugging his knees and muttering nonsense, his eyes wide like a deer caught in the headlights. The hog, that just until recently was his armchair, ran to Snape and sniffed his face before giving it a good lick. "Snape!" A painting pulled itself off the wall and hit Harry on the head, knocking him down, and then a jagged piece of broken glass broke free from the tornado and, spinning fast, stabbed him in the shoulder. The pain momentarily blinded him. He reached back, taking hold of it, and tore it from his shoulder, carelessly tossing it aside. "Snape!" Snape met Harry's eyes. Harry, still holding Voldemort's unconscious body, motioned at Snape to come to him. He didn't know if Snape would trust him. He didn't know if he deserved anyone's trust at this point. He still refused to leave Snape behind. He looked at him expectantly, hoping. Snape didn't move. The hog walked over Snape's feet and hurried away, and Snape goggled his eyes at the coffee table, which was now scratching its non-existent ear like a dog. Fuck it. He'd have to fetch Snape himself, or the man would never move. Harry placed Voldemort's body next to the living room's door and slowly crept toward Snape. He grabbed Snape's shoulder and shook him. "Snape, we need to go!" he shouted in Snape's ear. Snape shook his head. Above them, the ceiling cracked loudly. "Snape, now!" The fire on the couch sparked green, then purple. Harry slapped Snape across the face. He took hold of his head and looked into his eyes. "Severus, we need to go now." Something flashed in Snape's eyes, and he blinked as if he had just woken up from a trance. He nodded quickly. "Back door," he said. "Pantry." Snape nodded too. "Come." Together they crawled toward Voldemort, who was still stunned. Snape took hold of one of his arms while Harry gripped the other, and they dragged him to the pantry carefully, while a hurricane swirled above their heads. The Obliviators were still nowhere to be seen. Harry's knees hurt from all the crawling, and his shoulder blade was burning up from what the glass shard had done to him. But he ignored all of it, and he kept going. They had almost reached the pantry when they stumbled upon the can of beans Harry had put in the fridge earlier. "This is rather upsetting," the can said gracefully in a heavy French accent, and then, very fast, opened up and slashed through the air, almost slicing Snape's throat open. Snape froze again, open mouth. Harry kicked the can to the side and pulled him along. "Can you carry him?" Snape panted when they reached the back door. Not looking sure at all, Snape nodded. He picked up Voldemort's body and took several deep breaths. "Open it!" he shouted at Harry, who opened the door at once. They sprinted out of the house, Harry clutching his bleeding shoulder and Snape carrying Voldemort until they reached Snape's car. Snape fumbled with the keys for a terribly long minute before finally tearing the door open and shoving Voldemort into the back seat. Harry jumped into the passenger seat and banged the door closed, hissing when his wounded shoulder made contact with the back of the seat. Two masked wizards came out of Snape's front door, running toward them. "Start the car!" Harry yelled. Snape couldn't even hold the key steady enough to switch on the ignition. "I'm trying! Just start the bloody car! What is happening?" The men had almost reached them, their long blue robes billowed behind them. "Go, Snape, go! Where to? Just go!" The men started with force and sped up fast. Harry turned to look at the wizards, who were now attempting to run after the car. "Faster, Snape!" Snape pressed the accelerator all the way. Snape's house, engulfed in flames, disappeared into the distance. "I've lost my mind," Snape muttered under his breath. Harry reached to touch his arm, but Snape jerked away. "Don't touch me, don't you dare touch me. My chair turned into a pig." Harry was still looking behind them, to make sure they hadn't been followed. "What the fuck just happened in there? What the fuck just happened to my house? I think they lost us. My beans tried to kill me." "Tom," Harry lightly shook Voldemort's leg. "Is he dead?" "He's just stunned. It's a simple hex. It'll wear off in a bit." "It'll wear off? Stunned? My living room exploded. Like magic," Harry offered. He couldn't help it. He was happy. He hadn't seen magic in years. He didn't think he'd see magic again. There was hope. There was still a way to go back. He didn't know how, but he knew they could. He'd be with Ginny again. He'd be with his friends again. They were going to figure it out, and he was going to go back. "Magic!" Snape squealed hysterically. "Wizards!" "Calm down." Snape shook his head. He glanced at Harry distrustfully. "You must have killed me," he said weakly. "I must be dead." "Keep driving," Harry said. If they know how to apparate, then we're still in danger. Where do I go? Snape clenched the wheel. Where? I don't know, just keep driving. If they apparate... They cannot apparate, Voldemort croaked from the back seat, barely audibly. Harry immediately turned to him. Tom? He took hold of Voldemort's wrist to check his heartbeat. How are you feeling? They came through the door, Voldemort managed to say, blood spluttering from his lips. They wouldn't... He squeezed his eyes shut, baring his teeth. They wouldn't have come through the door if they could apparate. He stuttered. They would have... straight to the living room. Harry nodded in understanding. Their wands worked, though. They had magic. Magic! Snape's voice was high-pitched and reedy. Malfunctioning magic, Voldemort said, drifting unconscious once again. Harry pressed his palm to his chest. He was breathing. This isn't right, he said, unzipping his bag hastily. This doesn't make any sense. He fished out his notebook and pen, and quickly flipped to an empty page. Obliviators, he wrote fast. 2, maybe more. 1 is a woman. Malfunctioning magic? Question mark? Snape snatched the notebook from Harry's hand and threw it toward the back seat viciously. He gripped Harry's arm in a painfully tight grip and shook him. You have approximately 5 minutes to explain what the fuck just happened to my house, in detail. I will not hesitate to kick both of you out of the car and let you rot, do you understand me? I demand to know what just happened, now. I told you, Harry said flatly. They wanted to erase your memories. Snape released Harry's arm and banged his fist on the horn hard with each word as he shouted, Memories cannot be erased. Just keep driving, Harry replied. I'll explain everything when we're safe. Snape rubbed his face. He glanced at Voldemort through the rearview mirror. Are you sure he isn't dead? He's fine. Snape glanced at Harry, too. His eyes lingered on Harry's shoulder. You're hurt. I'm fine. I've had worse. After a moment, Snape laughed. It sounded like the laughter of someone slowly descending to madness. Are you a wizard? Abracadabra and all that? Harry offered him a soft smile. Do you believe me now? Snape huffed. He didn't reply. He rubbed his face again as aggressively as he could and continued driving.
All right. Yeah, that's pretty wild.
You're okay.
That was wild.
Arrisha is an amazing author. Some of her other stories have included the syntax of things, ab extra and ab intra. Actually reverse those, but yeah, have to recommend it. One thing I really like about this scene is it really lets Snape kind of fall apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do like that. You know, I mean, as much control as he has over himself in canon, there are many times where he is falling apart and freaking out. And I appreciate when that aspect of him is shown in fan fiction. And I think especially in this where like he's not the Snape that we know. He doesn't know about magic. And he's maybe never had his life threatened to the degree that he did in canon. He is just all out freaking out. I love that.
Yeah.
Just an average guy living my average life.
Is he a postal worker or the mailbag is just like a style of bag? No, he said he had students.
Yeah, he's a teacher in a boys' Catholic school.
Okay.
Can't remember if it's science or chemistry, something like that.
It's got to be, I mean, Muggle Snape has either got to be a chemistry teacher or like a cooking home economics teacher.
Oh.
Yeah, he does. He writes, what was it? The reason why Harry found him was he wrote like an astronomy article.
Oh, cool.
Like in a magazine or something, was how he like came across his name and knew that he was in that world.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that has to, for all of them in that scene, I mean, just probably the funniest thing in this whole story. And, you know, with this, it's like Voldemort is just literally, he has his personality, but he's this old man with no magic that's just, you know, has all these health issues and he's tired. Harry has to take care of him, but he's still like, you know, is very like prideful or has things to say. He's actually really funny in this story, which I love from the perspective of you wouldn't imagine Voldemort being funny.
Right.
Yeah, and it's just, but I can only imagine from the point of view of everyone talking about like who we knew you were and talking about this other person that isn't obviously, you know, from Snape's point of view, like that's not me. These crazy people are just like have me trapped in my home, you know, with a gun, magic, absurd, you know, all this just nonsense. It's just like this young kid, just whatever. It's yeah.
And this is Snary?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to have to read
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I highly recommend it.
It's wild. It's
It sure sounds like it.
I mean, I just like I don't want to go on a tangent about this story, but it's just there's so many things about this. It's so well written,
Yeah.
but there's so many parts of it that she's so good at just really making the reader, I don't know, like angry and frustrated, and then have to like be like, okay, this has to get better, or answers have to come, or things like that. Like it just the whole time I'm like, I have to keep reading because none of this makes sense, and I need to find out why this is happening.
Yeah.
But it's really good. It's really, oh my gosh, it's just I'm still amazed that this whole story and the whole world and the whole concept behind this thing, like where did the idea come from? It's just absolutely amazing to me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a great
yeah.
idea.
Okay. We'll switch gears and go to SSHG. This is, I guess, in the genre of sick fic,
Ooh, I love that.
and it's Do Not Go Gentle by Senlinyu, and chapter 1, and it's complete, and it's read by Snail. Do Not Go Gentle by Senlinyu.
Do Not Go Gentle by Senlinyu. Chapter 1. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Dylan Thomas. It was subtle at first. For the first several months, she assumed it was merely the stress of the war. For the next several months, she assumed it was the stress of the trials. Then when winter approached, she assumed it was stress from school. She kept assuming it was stress until she was walking to the cabinet to retrieve her supplies for potions class and the walls began closing in, wobbling and swallowing her up. When she woke again, she was in the Hogwarts hospital ward. Severus Snape stood at her bedside, staring down at her with an expression of profound irritation. "Did you never consider having that injury on your arm examined by a professional?" he asked as she sat up in bed. His voice was low and rasping. His throat had been permanently damaged from Nagini's bite. Hermione looked down at the still raw wound carved into her forearm. Mudblood. The bandages she kept wound carefully around her arm to cover it had been removed. It was bleeding again. It never stopped bleeding, no matter what she did to try to staunch it. She turned her arm to hide the ragged incisions from view. Fleur treated it. She said it was cursed not to heal. It's not very deep, and I keep it clean. It didn't seem worth making a fuss about. His lip curled into a derisive sneer. "It's killing you." Hermione stared at him blankly, feeling as though he'd stepped forward and struck her. Her lungs wouldn't take any oxygen, her throat closed, and she just looked at him. After a moment, she looked back down at her arm again and drew a stuttering breath. Somehow, even though she hadn't considered it, she felt strangely unsurprised. She was so tired. She couldn't remember when she'd last enjoyed eating or read a book without developing a migraine or been able to summon a sense of excitement about anything. Everything had required effort for so long, she'd gotten used to it. Now, as she sat in bed thinking about it, it had all started after Malfoy Manor. That was when everything had begun getting increasingly difficult and painful. It was hard to make herself think about Malfoy Manor. Hermione preferred not to if she could possibly help it. If Hermione hadn't been tortured there, they wouldn't have realized Bellatrix had Hufflepuff's cup. If Hermione hadn't been tortured, Harry wouldn't have disarmed Draco Malfoy and gained the loyalty of the Elder Wand. They would have lost the war. Malfoy Manor had been a vital necessity, a tipping point in the war. Dobby had died. Hermione hadn't been conscious when Dobby died. She'd only found out afterwards when she woke and heard that Harry was digging a grave. Harry often talked about Dobby's death. It was one of the most deeply significant events of the entire war for him. When Malfoy Manor was brought up, Dobby was the first person Harry referred to. Sometimes he would belatedly mention that Hermione had been brilliant and lied under torture. But Dobby's death was the most important aspect of that day. It was the tragedy. Torture was a distant second, and one that Harry and everyone else preferred not to acknowledge as having happened at all. Hermione never felt as though there was any context in which it was acceptable to bring up a cut on her arm that kept bleeding. She was lucky to have just been tortured. A lot of other people had died. She stared across the room at the white dividing curtain for several seconds as she sat absorbing it all. "I suppose it's not reversible, is it?" she finally asked. "It's not intended to be." She nodded slowly. If Snape was telling her that she was going to die, she probably was. Otherwise, she would have woken in St. Mungo's. "How long do I have?" "If you bothered to take your health seriously, you might manage to last a year." His voice was cold. Her skin prickled painfully. Her organs were shriveling, and she thought she might throw up. Her heart was beginning to pound, and as a result, all the little cuts on her arm had started to throb. They always throbbed, as though she had a pulse point there. When her heartbeat sped up, the throbbing would reflect it. All the precisely carved letters in her arm would start to bleed. She'd gotten into the habit of ignoring the throbbing, or pressing her palm lightly against it. Sometimes the pressure and warmth of her hand helped. As she sat stiffly in the hospital bed, trying not to have an emotional breakdown in front of a professor who had never regarded her existence as anything but a nuisance, several streams of blood started making their way towards her wrist. Her blood was thin and watery-looking. Somehow, in the midst of all the effort that it took to complete her homework and make it to class, she hadn't noticed. She didn't know why Madame Pomfrey or Headmistress McGonagall couldn't be the ones telling her that she was probably going to die before she turned 20. Her eyes burned, and she had to blink to keep her vision clear. She had decided after the war that she wasn't going to cry about things anymore. It was exhausting and always gave her a migraine. So she wouldn't. She simply refused to. She swallowed, and the words seemed stuck in her throat for a moment before she managed to force them out. "Thank you for telling me, Professor Snape. I apologize for disrupting your class today." Snape snorted, and then coughed when it aggravated his damaged vocal cords. "There is a reason I am the one informing you. I have several theoretical potions that may slow the effects of the curse, or stop it, although you may prefer care at St. Mungo's. However," his jaw rolled slightly, as though the words coming out of his mouth had a vile taste to them, "if you choose to remain at Hogwarts, as Potions Master, I will endeavor to develop a cure for you." Hermione stared at him for several seconds. Going to St. Mungo's would mean withdrawing from school and living either at the hospital or with the Weasleys. It would mean being an invalid. It would mean telling Harry and Ron. Snape was an exceptional curse breaker. Dumbledore should have died within hours of putting on the gaunt ring. Instead, he lived for nearly a year because of the enchantment Snape had used to slow the curse. If she had a year, Snape might be able to stretch it out into a decade or more. If she stayed at Hogwarts for her newts, she might have more opportunity to use the time she had left constructively. "You may inform the headmistress of your choice." He drew himself up, his shoulders rising so that he looked extremely bat-like, his unfriendly black eyes glowering down at her, as though he were trying to make it as clear as possible that he was only offering his aid because he was obligated to. He appeared to be on the verge of turning and sweeping away. "I would like to stay, if that's all right with you, Professor," Hermione said quickly, her voice low. Snape froze and peered down at her with an impassive expression on his face. After a moment, he blinked. "I hope you're not inflicting yourself upon me because you think I would be offended if you choose to withdraw." Hermione's throat tightened, but she raised her chin. "No." He made a snorting coughing sound in the back of his throat, turned and left, his black robes billowing behind him. After Hermione was discharged from the hospital, she spent most of her evenings in the dungeons, her arm unbandaged and laid across Snape's private lab table while he muttered incantations over it, and mixed up potions that she either had to gag down or grit her teeth and let him apply to the raw wound on her arm. Bellatrix had used a cursed blade and cast an additional curse on the injury at some point when Hermione had been tortured. Because of the way Bellatrix had used the Cruciatus on Hermione immediately after cursing the wound, the curse had not set properly. Instead of staying concentrated in Hermione's arm until it was lethal enough to kill her, the curse had distributed itself and set throughout her bloodstream. Hermione was still alive as a result, but although the curse was weakened by the distribution, it was also impossible to counter by any traditional method. Snape was a viciously unpleasant companion. He worked in stony silence and didn't speak to her at all except to snap at her to move out of his way, or resentfully interrogate her about how she felt before and after he dosed her with nauseating potions, and then glower at her answers as though she were being intentionally incurable. Hermione was too tired to contribute any conversation and didn't think he'd appreciate it if she tried to. She sat quietly and read her textbooks, jotting down notes, or just watched him work, theorizing about what he was doing. She'd hoped that eventually things would become routine enough that spending time with him wouldn't feel like having her emotions exhaustively rubbed down with sandpaper, but if anything, Snape became progressively more unpleasant as the weeks rolled by and Hermione's health deteriorated further. She stopped reading and simply sat with her head resting on a stack of textbooks while he worked until she fell asleep there. She'd wake up in an empty lab, levitated onto a couch with a blanket draped over her. She missed a homework deadline for the first time in her life, fainted in charms class, and then fainted again in history of magic 3 days later. Minerva called her into her office and asked if perhaps she should write and tell her friends of her illness, since it was difficult to conceal when she regularly arrived late to class and looked ghastly pale. Hermione gnawed her lip. Most of her friends had not returned to Hogwarts, at least not any that Hermione regularly interacted with. She'd been clear when the school year started that there was little reflected glory available to glean from her. Hermione had not returned to Hogwarts for new friends or to tell stories about all the adventures she'd had with Ron and Harry. She had never been particularly well-liked among the larger student population. It had only taken a few weeks before she was predominantly left alone, although the fainting had recently drawn attention. It was only a matter of time before word got out that there was something wrong with her. "Harry and Ron are visiting Hogsmeade weekend," she said after a silence. "I'll tell them then, in person." After a long, late evening in Snape's lab, she made her way slowly out of the dungeons. She reached the foot of the stairs and stopped on the 3rd step, feeling too drained to climb them. She wondered if she had reached a low enough point to go ask a Slytherin prefect to levitate her up to the 1st floor. Her shoulders slumped. Once she got out of the dungeons, there would be more stairs, and then more. When she reached the Gryffindor Tower, there would be 7 final flights in order to reach her bed. Maybe it was time to admit she was dying. She should withdraw from Hogwarts and make the most of the remaining time, rather than try to pretend she'd catch a lucky break and end up with more. What possible use would her corpse have with a Hogwarts diploma or newts? It was delusional of her to even be there. Her eyes started burning as she stared at the staircase. She buried her face in her hands and struggled to choke back a sob. "Is it so unbearable to admit you need assistance that you must instead waste everyone's time by weeping on the stairs?" rasped Snape's enraged voice directly into her ear. One of his hands firmly wrapped itself around her waist, and the other gripped her right arm to stabilize her as he walked her up the stairs and out of the dungeons. Some of us wish to enjoy the severely limited personal time they still possess. His hands were warm through her robes. She focused on his bruising grip rather than on the dizzy pounding in her head. He didn't leave her at the top of the dungeon staircase, but escorted her to the hospital ward and handed her over into the care of Madame Pomfrey. While Hermione was collapsing into a bed, she could hear his low, grinding voice giving Pomfrey a long list of exacting instructions. The next day, Minerva arrived to announce that Hermione's room was being relocated. She was going to be moved to the staff housing wing, private quarters with not nearly so many stairs, and Severus was also going to be there, to keep an eye on her and work to reverse the curse. They were spending most of their time together as it was. This way it would be less disruptive, and Hermione would not be required to traverse the entire castle every evening after a school day. Hermione rather felt as though McGonagall had just firmly announced the intention to house Hermione within the constant proximity of an aggressive scorpion, but her choices currently were Snape or St. Mungo's. St. Mungo's felt like giving up. Snape scowled furiously at her while relocating his entire private lab into the kitchen of their quarters, and glowered with cold rage while ferrying boxes into his room. Hermione lay curled into a small heap on the sofa, trying unsuccessfully not to take every muttered profanity personally. Living with Snape was as unbearable as she had feared it would be. He barely spoke to her, he just glared balefully when storming through the apartment carrying armloads of essays to his room to grade, and made constant references to treasured personal time that no longer existed. When he wasn't teaching, he was either grading homework or stooped over dozens of cauldrons, furiously trying to develop a cure for Hermione's curse. He treated her continuously deteriorating health as though it were both a personal and professional insult. Hermione finally made her way to the headmistress's office with a withdrawal form in hand. "I appreciate that you asked Professor Snape to help me, but I think I should be realistic about my chances," Hermione said after she dropped into a seat across from the headmistress's desk, her head feeling achingly hollow. "I've disrupted his life more than enough during the last month. Asking him to supervise me during his time off, in addition to all the hours he'd spent trying to develop a cure, is too much of an imposition." McGonagall leaned back in her seat, Hermione's withdrawal form dangling between her fingers. Her dark eyes stared shrewdly at Hermione for a moment before she spoke. "I am not Albus Dumbledore, Miss Granger. The faculty of Hogwarts are faculty. They do not work here as a favor to me, or perform extensive non-contractual research at my request. Severus volunteered to develop a cure for you of his own initiative, brought to my attention that Gryffindor Tower was difficult to access, and proposed the relocation of his laboratory." Hermione stared at McGonagall until the corner of the headmistress's mouth twitched. She leaned forward, and her sharp gaze softened as she studied Hermione, sliding the withdrawal slip across her desk. "Severus is a difficult man, even on his best days. If you would prefer to be transferred to St. Mungo's, I understand. However, I assure you, Severus's efforts have been entirely of his own initiative and volition. You are not imposing on anyone." Hermione stood, and, picking up the withdrawal form up off the desk, she slipped it into her pocket and returned to her bedroom, curling up in bed and pressing a hand against her throbbing arm. She heard the door bang, Snape's muttered cursing, and the sound of clattering cauldrons and supplies being removed from their jars. When the noise eased to the faint tap of a knife chopping ingredients and the soft hissing of rising steam, Hermione stood up and made her way to the doorway to watch him work. She had no idea why Snape would want to go to all the effort of trying to cure her, when she'd been convinced her entire life that he utterly abhorred her. He'd worked for decades to protect Lily Potter's son. It had been the point of everything he'd done. Hermione couldn't understand why he bothered to do anything for her. His coal-black eyes were fastened on the contents of a small silver cauldron as he stirred it rapidly and added several drops of armadillo bile. He was completely immersed in brewing, his expression a stark contrast to the indolent one worn during classes. He had stopped even pretending to care about teaching potions class. He was no longer head of Slytherin, and he had no inclination towards showing favoritism towards anyone. He was bored, she realized. 17 years of teaching the same classes to children he loathed, trying to cure her was something interesting to do. He'd probably made the initial offer thinking it would be easy, and now he was continuing out of pride and obstinacy that there was a problem that was beating him. He wasn't saving Hermione Granger, he was just interested in getting the better of the thing on her arm. He was getting the better of Bellatrix Lestrange. The fact that Hermione was the person attached to the problem was a coincidental nuisance. Snape didn't appear to even notice her as she stood in the doorway watching him work. His cheekbones were flushed from the heat, and his nostrils were flared. She stayed a few minutes longer before retreating into her room. A picture of Harry and Ron sat on the small table beside her bed, lying face down. Hermione lifted the picture up and stared at Harry and Ron's grinning faces for a minute before laying it face down again and turning to her textbooks. She was going to have to tell them she was dying when she saw them on the weekend, and she didn't want to think about it.
Okay. I think it's kind of interesting how she seems to discount any possibility that he could have any regard for her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, at first it's like, no, he's being forced to do this. And then the second is he's bored.
Mm-hmm.
It couldn't possibly be me.
And I love, that kind of characterization of Snape where, his entire attitude and his words would lead you to believe that he hates this person, he's sick of them, but then his actions convey the complete opposite, that he actually cares for them a great deal.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say like in canon, but I'm not sure if he ever actually cares for Harry at that point. We know things change later.
Yeah.
And interesting about the nature of curses and how they can, be a lot worse.
Yeah. I love the trope of like curse as a terminal illness. And I think that that's such a good kind of story structure to have in any kind of ship or gen fic that involves Snape.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course he's going to take it personally, that he wants to solve this problem, and he's going to get mad if he can't.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we're going to go to a rare pair, Severus and Minerva. The fic is Year of the Thestral. And while it's not actually completed, it's almost there. It's, I don't know. It's the first fic that ever made me cry.
Oh.
Yeah. It's really very angsty. It basically covers the year that Snape is headmaster and is told from Minerva's point of view.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah. This is the section from Chapter 2, Year of the Thestral by Perverse Idol, read by the author.
Hi, this is Perverse Idol, reading a section from my fanfic, Year of the Thestral. The story follows the canon timeline and covers Snape's year as headmaster, the events that unfold between him and Minerva McGonagall, and how they affect her after his death. The story is told from Minerva's POV, and this scene is from Chapter 2, a staff meeting that takes place in September 1997. The first to arrive, she found the door locked and heard the muffled overlap of men's voices beyond, dulled by the thick wood. Should she knock? She shouldn't have to ask for admittance, not here. Out of sorts, she flicked a spell that struck the door 3 sharp blows. Inside, the sound stopped, and a few seconds later the door creaked open like an invitation to a haunted house. Minerva sailed in and took her seat at the long table that had usurped all the comfortable chairs in the staff lounge, a regimental rejection of the once relaxing, informal atmosphere. With the barest of nods and the sunken eyelids of a man who'd been working all night, the headmaster swept a mess of overlapping, curling parchment into a disorderly pile. He was alone, of course. Minerva glanced around at the paintings on the walls. No one there either. A soft tap, and the sheaf of papers vanished. A single scroll remained, rolling gently to the table's edge. Severus smoothed it out and started scribbling in silence. Minerva waited, refusing to look at him, the intensity of her dream still potent in her veins. Her colleagues gathered at the appointed time, creased with sleep and pinched with cold. She could almost see their collected breaths hanging in the chill air. The Caros arrived several minutes late, dashing Minerva's hopes that they would skip the meeting altogether. The headmaster called them to order, consulted his parchment, and led them through the agenda. A chair creaked now and then, but there was no response to any of the proposed items, no sound except the Caros sniggering and whispering together, a new unbearable disruption. Professor Flitwick. Slinking out of a gap in the silence, the traitor's voice glided down the table, and teachers on both sides subtly recoiled. Word has it you continue giving lessons in frivolous magic. Should this rumor persist, it may be necessary for me to attend one of your classes and experience your methods for myself." The voice, already quiet, sank even lower, fangs in flesh. "Consider how much we will both be spared if I'm not forced to correct you in public." "I'm using the same coursework I always have," Phileas said reasonably. "Where did you find the pluck to address such infuriating accusations without sounding either rebellious or meek? Minerva couldn't have stomached it." "I've never had complaints before." "When a mistake is brought to your attention, Professor, do you believe it wise or sufficient to make excuses?" Merlin's teeth, that Severus of all people had the gall to use that line. How fortunate I'm the one catching you in this, and not the Dark Lord. The barely veiled threat filtered over the room like black snow. After allowing them a moment to absorb the chill, Severus said, "From now on, restrict your materials to the curriculum as issued. Cheering charms are an utter waste of the student's time." Once the teacher's lounge had provided a comforting refuge. Supervising excitable little powder kegs possessed of more hormones than magic, and more magic than sense, put one in dire need of asylum from the chaotic hallways. Even during the last few years, when Harry's presence had attracted bizarre outbreaks of escalating danger, Minerva had relied without question on the camaraderie of her colleagues. She'd swapped anecdotes about adolescent troublemakers and assignment headaches, shared collective wisdom, and sometimes roared with laughter at the antics, or ignorance, of dunderheaded students. She'd felt equal to handling the more disturbing situations because her friends had been there with her. The professor who promoted the term dunderhead, not that Minerva approved of calling students such things to their faces, presided over them now in the position of ultimate authority. Whether more ultimate than Albus, Minerva couldn't say, as Severus's authority stemmed from something unnatural lurking behind the scenes. Seated between a tight-lipped Phileas and a sphinx-faced Sinistra, she fumed in silence. These meetings were attempts to quell and control, to cow Dumbledore's faithful into submission. Warned to hold a quill or nothing, they all kept their hands folded in plain sight on the table. Hers were white-knuckled, Sinistra's patiently interlaced. Rolanda fidgeted. Phileas's hands lay flat, thumbs and index fingers barely touching. Pomona's were kept one inside the other, palms turned inward, as if protecting a precious object. Horace, sitting as far down the table from Severus as he could get, hadn't stopped examining his nails since they convened. Madam Hooch, regarding a change in curriculum that failed to make it onto the agenda. Until further notice, all Quidditch training and all games are suspended. Putting students on brooms during this period of upheaval will only lead them to wandering off castle grounds and possibly encountering at-loose fugitives while out practicing alone. Until year's end, you'll be on rotation, working at different tasks as I see fit. Beyond that, we'll have to see how matters stand. I reckoned it was something of the sort when students failed to show up for class, Rolanda said with a hint of cheek. Severus responded to the hint with a wintry smile. Minerva shrugged her shawl further up her shoulders. Ominous, this cold. September, yes, but the bite of fear infused it with an early frost. The very least the bloody headmaster could do was cast a warming charm. They weren't all accustomed to dungeon temperatures, but Merlin forbid anyone but Severus reach for their wand. Professor Sprout, the greenhouses are falling behind on producing the quantities of monkshood and baneberry necessary for upkeep of our potion stores. And so it went. No gossip or laughter or pots of tea, no debate, no discussion of how educational standards had been put on the chopping block. The children would be heading down to breakfast soon. At intervals, the appalling Carrows emitted little jeers and useless embellishments. What malevolent piglets they were! The only satisfaction to be got from this entire farce was seeing Severus pass a butcher's appraising eye over them. Not yet ripe for the slaughter, but anyone not named Carrow, could tell he looked forward to disposing of them himself. The whetted edge of his disgust rather gave it away. Once Minerva would have said she knew this man. But to know a smart, spidery, unkempt, unpleasant child who got knocked about a fair deal, so sullenly uncooperative when asked to explain himself, it was hard to feel compassion. To know a raw, unsuited, downright repellent young recruit, clearly harrowed and haunted by bad associations, thrown into a teaching position that allowed him to take his resentments out on those in his care, was not to know a bloody thing, apparently. To know that Severus had changed over the years, no less acerbic, but more capable of handling himself without disgrace or constant suspicion, more at ease with her and Phileas and several others he'd appeared to respect, appeared being the operative word, was to know how thoroughly they had been duped. What really mattered was how much he knew. It frightened her, so Minerva tried not to dwell on it. Severus knew the core members of the Order. He could enter Grimmauld Place. He could name which officials in the ministry were working in secret to support their side. Albus's side. He was probably better versed than anyone in Albus's plans. He'd bored so deeply into the structure of the resistance, he need merely lean on a weak spot to see it all collapse. Nor was that the only way he infiltrated and undermined. There were dreams. Dreams born of stress and confusion and loathing. Dreams of struggling with him in terrible silence, pulling him back or out or deeper. Always in some huge, shadowy limbo, the hot swell of elusive darkness that represented Severus, dissolving in her arms and reforming again, forever out of reach, a blurry, malevolent presence. There were only 2 instances Minerva could recall with any clarity, and in both of them, Severus wasn't recognizably Severus. She hadn't seen his face, barely saw a figure, but whenever her hands had found something solid in the morass of darkness, before it melted from her grasp, she'd known. She'd felt it was him. They were terrible, these dreams. Terrible because they were unmistakably erotic. Minerva couldn't describe exactly what made them so, but the first time she started up from sleep, sweat in her hair and under her arms, her body had been one enormous pulse of sexual energy, and she'd burned with shame. In the light of day, she understood how one's deepest primitive feelings could be twisted, transformed by the chaos of the sleeping mind. Intense emotions triggered similar trembles of response in the body. One shouldn't put too much stock in these shadows, not as direct translations of reality. It made sense that her mind and heart was struggling to reject what Severus had become, what Severus had always been, while being forced to reach for him, hold him back, hold him down. His attention flicked suddenly toward her. Minerva instantly pinned her gaze on Pomona sitting across the table, bushy ringlets partly obscuring her face, fingers plucking at her unused quill. Beside her, Rolanda twitched Minerva a conspiratorial wink. All pens were down, all parchments blank, all faces stony with suppressed mutiny. No one had scribbled a word. At the first staff meeting, it had been made clear there were to be no criticisms, no unsolicited proposals for curriculum changes, no questions. Rather like a corpse levitating from the grave, Severus rose from his chair. One last item. Very quietly, Minerva let the air out of her lungs. One more petty excuse for intimidation, and they'd be free. By now, Severus said tersely, you have all borne witness to the changes, and I hope you understand, if you didn't before, that the consequences for disobedience are of a different caliber from previous years. Infractions of our Lord's rule will draw swift punishment down upon the heads of offenders and those of their allies. I suggest you refrain from finding out exactly what I mean by that. There was a faint rustle of backsides shifting in seats, a worried flicker of glances up and down the table. I suspect none of you will be surprised to learn there have been attempts by various parties inside the castle to contact the rebels outside. The distasteful task of ensuring the loyalty of those in charge of our children falls to me. I haven't time to spare for the more traditional methods, so I'm choosing expedience instead. Most of you will no doubt object to this. I'll pass your objections on to the Dark Lord, only if I have to. There was an infinitesimal breath of hesitation before he said, I'll let you have a moment to prepare. The room had frozen. Everyone at table glanced around, openly alarmed and perplexed. Prepare for what? Minerva had an inkling, but before she could say anything, Severus raised his wand for silence. Let's begin. Professor Sprout, your attention, please. Pomona raised her head, baffled, her hands grasping nervously at each other. Such a horribly helpless gesture. Minerva remembered Halliburton doing the same. Of course, said Master, but what? Look at me. Wait, Minerva cried, but Severus had already twitched his wand. His gaze sharpened, Pomona put a hand to her mouth, and whatever communion or violation occurred was over within seconds. Rolanda laid an arm across Pomona's shoulders. All right there, old girl. Well, yes, but... Faint creases of dismay lingered on Pomona's face, fading as this grotesque trespass upon her privacy joined all the other proof that Severus would stop at nothing. He could only be trusted to betray and betray, over and over. Madam Hooch? Minerva slammed her hands flat on the table. Headmaster! This must stop right now. We are here in our professional capacity, and your demand is utterly unacceptable. Severus's gaze didn't waver, and Rolanda widened her eyes at Minerva, clearly reluctant to obey, but dreading what would happen if she didn't. Minerva levered herself partway out of her chair. Surely you can't expect us to believe this is legal. There are more exceptions to the rule of law than can be dreamt of in your philosophy, Minerva, Severus said quietly. Please sit down. I warned you expedience was a priority. This is nothing more than the former headmaster would do if he felt the circumstances were warranted. Unless you mean to tell me no one in this room was aware of that? He ran his fingers over his wand. Let me be clear. You are not at liberty to refuse. From their front row seats next to Severus, Alecto Caro burst out in giggles, and her brother pointed a finger. Yeah, shut your trap, old witch. You don't get to decide what's right or wrong here, get it? The headmaster turned, his profile strangely reminiscent of a reaper's scythe. Professors Caro, and the knife-in-teeth scrape added that elusive taste of blood to his voice. Please stay out of it, or you will not remain exempt. As the siblings shrank back, one with a grumble and the other a snort, Rolanda folded her arms on the table, deliberately looking away. Sorry, sir. I just don't think my Quidditch fantasies are any of your business. The strained humour brought a slight curl to Severus's lips. Minerva, seeing that none of her colleagues were ready to challenge him, dropped back into her seat, despairing. This isn't a game. The nerve of him to address the room as if they were a class on the eve of a test. Catching the snitch won't end in victory. Depends on how you define snitch, doesn't it? Rolanda remarked to the tabletop. And so we come to the point. The snap of annoyance served as a reminder that yes, this was a test of Severus's patience. Are you the snitch in this case, Madam Hooch? I sincerely doubt it. But, his wand flicked, needs must. Having served for so long as Albus's deputy, Minerva was familiar with a range of skills among the staff. None were trained in occlumency but herself and Severus, at least not to the extent necessary to keep such an artful legilimens at bay. Her calculated feint come to nothing, Rolanda endured the assault, then cast herself back in her chair with a gusty sigh. Minerva forced herself to breathe. Pomona patted Rose's shoulder, whispering loudly enough for the entire table to hear. Buck up, dear. It was worth a try. Vector was next, submitting without protest. So far, Severus had stopped short of mental bludgeoning. No taunts, no forcing their compliance with threats of torture. He was quick, he was ruthless. In search of what? What did he see? Whose secrets? How much blackmail material did he need? He was so... Minerva caught herself staring and blinked down, irked by her own carelessness. Controlled, that was it. His power was infinitely calmer and more contained than the faceless, writhing heat that infected her dreams. Merlin's teeth, bloody stupid to think of that now. Professor Slughorn? She heard Horace's chair scrape an inch or so over the floor, caught his nervous little hum, his weak chuckle. Oh, come now, Severus, is this really necessary? The head of Slytherin, old chap? You don't seriously believe I'm... A flash of panic stuck her lungs to her ribs. She could draw her wand, but then what? Beside her, Phileas sat, as if praying to the table, hands pressed down flat, brow furrowed, eyes shut. They should have anticipated and prepared for the dangers of having a legilimens in charge. But how? How to resist? Deflect? Of course, what leaped clamouring to the forefront were all the private matters she needed to keep as far from the headmaster, the usurper, as possible. All contact with Kingsley and Nymphadora, all knowledge and names of rebellious students, their hiding places, their secret codes, their loyalty to Harry, their wish for someone to protect them, their sobs in the common rooms, their longing for home, and their fear, their terrible fear. Phileas's eyes sprang open, accompanied by a silent gasp, a little jump of his shoulders. He stared at Severus as if he'd been stabbed in the back. Even now, the shock of ambush, the difficulty of believing Severus would do this to them. Across the table, Rolanda sent Minerva a stealthy thumbs up. The silence of Severus's unspoken summons fell upon her like the tap of an obsidian wand. Coolly, Minerva turned her head and stared back. She had the right, damn him. A cat may look on a scoundrel as well as on a king. Let him see her contempt, her withering scorn. Let him see her defiance, her desire. It snapped across his path, the erotic shape-shifting of her sleeping mind, there and gone, a flare of breath-stopping arousal. The memory flinched through her, an unconscious depravity, born of horror and disgust. The remembered heat of it trailed a burnt wraith behind. Heat of anger, night sweats, of waking damp between her legs with suffocating nightmare lust. It didn't matter that they were only dreams. She might as well have exhaled a cloud of pheromones into Severus's face. She had spilled a humiliating secret, blood for the hunter, a clear mental lure he could follow no matter how desperately she tried to hide it. And pursue he did, rippling through the shadows, lured on by the scent of guilty pleasure. The weight of his gaze didn't widen or otherwise give him away, but to Minerva's alarm the foreign presence inside her brushed over one raw edge after another, caught up with every fleeing thought, merged and blended along those seams of sensitive memory. Wherever his magic and her mind met, a hungry, inchoate heat spread from him to her, a wisp here, a lick there, a stroke, a tease, and every trespass, every touch, inflamed the lingering traces of dream, reawakening those smoking remnants piece by piece. Then he was gone. Minerva managed not to make a sound, but only just. Her cheeks burned. He had seen. She swallowed. He had, but that was all he'd seen. Across the table, Ro and Pomona were watching her anxiously, and Minerva forced out a perfunctory nod. "Well," Severus said with almost insulting composure to the room at large, "thank you all for your cooperation. Let this serve as notice that I'll be conducting similar inspections as events unfold, and despite what most of you have been taught," he paused to bestow an idle, baleful smile upon the Caros, "I don't need to look into your eyes. It's the most common method, of course, but if the legilimens is skilled enough, not required." His black, sleepless gaze roved over them, unfazed by the seething anger staring back. "Over the years, I've looked into your eyes 1,000 times. I know the windows of your souls and can enter your minds at will." He pointed his wand, and the morning's useless agenda burst into flames. Meeting adjourned.
So good.
Oh, I love that ending.
Oh, this is a wonderful fic.
Yeah, that was really good writing. A lot of the phrasing seemed kind of poetic.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely want to read the rest of it. Oh, it is close. 17 out of 19 chapters, so
Yeah.
it's getting close.
Yeah. I shouldn't say it could be finished where it is right now, but I think
Mm-hmm.
the author has a little bit more to do with
Mm-hmm.
what's left. I'm looking forward to finding that out. Yes, it's like, oh my gosh, this had to be what that year was like. And it's totally Minerva's POV. So
Yeah. No idea what Snape could be thinking in that moment.
no, although he does basically take her up on it. but yeah, oh, so good. Yeah, just the legilimens part of it is so chilling.
Yeah. Definitely very ominous with, how I guess the tone is, ominous and erotic at the same time.
Yeah, I definitely recommend. Okay, let's go along to A Life More Ordinary by Lexin. A little bit of Snary for us from chapter 4 and read by Masao. Did you want to say something about it now, or do you want to wait till afterwards?
I can wait until after. I mean, I can just go ahead and say, because I do think that maybe some context would help. This fic was written, I believe, in 2002, quite a while ago. So, one, definitely before we know anything about Snape's family. And so, I think maybe the section I read alludes to this. Snape's family actually kind of sold him to Voldemort at a young age, around 12, I believe. So, he's not half-blood like he is in canon. And this is a forced marriage kind of fic. Dumbledore sees that a child between Snape and Harry would have some sort of special power to be able to defeat Voldemort. And so he requires them to get married and have a child. And so at this point in the story, they're living in Harry's apartment together in Manchester, and they have a young son who, much to Severus's displeasure, is named James.
All right. A Life More Ordinary.
Potter's habit of touching him in public was beginning to get on his nerves, rather. "Not here," Snape said one day at a feast. The school still had them, and Potter was often a guest. He was a local celebrity, after all. "Where, then?" Potter sounded exasperated. "You won't even let me hold your hand." "Why do you want to?" Potter looked confused. "You're my husband. Of course I want to." "Look at me," Snape hissed. Potter did. "What am I looking for?" he asked, after a moment. "You haven't seen?" "I recognize you. You're Severus Snape, my husband. What are you getting at?" Snape sighed and looked away. He just stopped himself from resting his head on the table in frustration. "I get it," said Potter, just as the dessert arrived. "What?" "You were trying to tell me you're ugly." Snape didn't say anything. He had been trying to say exactly that, but that didn't prepare him for someone else saying it. Potter grabbed his hand. "You're not, you know." Potter's hand tightened. "That's why you won't let me do the other thing as well, isn't it?" Snape stared at the green eyes. "Let go," he said. "We are not going to talk about that here." Potter let go. "But we will talk." Their babysitter gone, Potter faced him. "How long have you felt like this?" "You don't know how I feel." "You were doing a good impression of hideous and worthless at dinner. Were you pretending?" "No." Somehow, lying to Potter was never worth it, and Snape felt it beneath him in any case. "I know what everyone says about me. They're wrong." "You used to say them too." "Then No, I can't say I know you, even with James and having lived with you all these months, but I'm not ashamed of you. I ruined your life. Voldemort did that when he killed my parents, just as he ruined yours when he did those things to you. Being dragged into a prophecy hasn't helped either of us. But none of that was your doing." Potter sat down beside him on the sofa. It was small, but Snape pulled away as much as he could. Potter said, "But there are things you could do that would help." "Such as?" Snape tried hard to keep the sneer out of his voice, and partly succeeded. "Stop behaving like an apology and be my husband." "You mean, have sex with you." Partially, said Potter. I also mean that we could actually get to know each other. You never know. You might like me. I think I like you. Snape stood up and stared at him. You can't. Oh, sit down. What I mean is, the small amount of the real you I've ever seen seems okay. I will not remind you of the several incidents which would prove the opposite, not least because it reminded Snape of how much younger than himself Potter really was. He looked away, not wanting to see the expression in Potter's eyes as he remembered the various things Snape had done over the years. Snape sat down as Potter had asked him to, and stared at the carpet. He's trying his best, everybody seemed to have told Snape. Meet him halfway, talk to him. Snape took a deep breath. How about you stop touching me in public if I agreed to the sex thing with you in private? That's rather businesslike. Potter sounded rather taken aback. It's the only offer you're going to get. Very well. I agree. Snape had second thoughts almost immediately, but didn't retract the offer. He had half expected Potter to jump on him at once. He didn't know whether to be grateful or annoyed that he didn't. Grateful would have been more logical, he realized that, but he wanted to have reason to be angry, to take back his words, and he couldn't. All that happened was that from time to time, when they were alone, Potter would take his hand or touch him. Slowly, over the following days, the touches grew more intimate, and more frequent, but never in public. Not even in front of James, who hardly counted as public. Finally, just when Snape was beginning to feel he'd scream if nothing happened between them soon, Potter kissed him. It felt strange, as it had done before. It didn't hurt, and he'd agreed to let Potter use him, so knew he had no reason to object. And now, given carte blanche to explore, Potter did just that. It was strange to feel someone else's hands on his body, and he closed his eyes. He didn't want to see the triumph on Potter's face. Potter penetrated him, and the sensation of having that inside him was peculiar, as it had been the first time, the time James had been conceived. Potter took time and trouble to make sure he was ready, if not exactly eager, and Snape relaxed as much as he could and let it happen. It was an odd feeling, not unpleasant, and it felt as if he was reaching for something, but whatever it was, he didn't quite get there. When he opened his eyes again, the expression on Potter's face wasn't triumph, more a sort of curiosity, a lively interest he was sure he'd never seen in a potions lesson. Snape thought this most strange, but then Potter always had been weird. The next time it happened, he was more prepared for that odd reaching feeling, and rode along with it. Then something, hit him like the Hogwarts Express at full speed, and he knew nothing but that sensation. Potter looked extraordinarily, irritatingly pleased with himself. Snape was covered in fluid, sweat, mostly Potter's, and semen, his own, he realized. He felt strange, as if his entire body had been shifted in time and space and was now settling slowly. What was that? Potter's surprise showed. Orgasm, he said. You've never had one before? It seems not. Definitely not. He would have remembered a feeling like that. It was rather like the end of what he mentally categorized as a weird dream, but not quite. And he never liked those because of the mess they made. Not, he thought as he lay on the wet patch, that this made any less mess. Why had he ever thought lust was simple? The present Harry Potter gave him for his 40th birthday turned out to be a raging libido. Unintentionally, because he'd never told Potter when his birthday was. He was grateful for his foresight in not allowing Potter to touch him in public, or the school would have been treated to the sight of their potions master being shagged senseless by his Quidditch player husband, and not caring until afterwards. He could just manage to stop himself reaching out, but sometimes the desire was so strong it crawled over his skin like ants at a picnic. Now he understood what led the students to fornicate in corners. He could barely resist it himself. For all he'd been told, that lust was a powerful force. Until now it was if he'd been told that water was wet, but never put his hand in a stream. Now suddenly he'd been thrown in at the deep end. He wondered what Albus would have said. There was nobody else he could confide in. Snape's need for Potter's body consumed entirely too much of his waking hours. He didn't care if the man never said another word to him as long as he had that cock inside him at every available opportunity. Not that there were all that many opportunities with him working full-time and taking care of James. Potter seemed stunned, as well he might be, given that his difficult and unwilling husband had suddenly turned wanton. On the other hand, his Quidditch improved, and for a professional player, that could only be a good thing. Marking 6th year homework actually required some attention, so Snape hadn't listened to the start of whatever game James and Harry were having. At some stage over the last few weeks, probably during sex, Potter had become Harry, and stayed. But one phrase stood out. "If you don't behave, I'll keep you under the stairs." Wouldn't, James, of course. Wouldn't I? Snape looked up from his marking. Of course you wouldn't. I wouldn't let you. He put his quill down and turned. Why under the stairs? Potter ignored him and went on with the game. He waited until Harry had given James his lunch and convinced him to take his nap. Snape said, "What was all that stuff about keeping James under the stairs?" "It was a joke. I know. This is a flat. There are no stairs. But it's a strange joke. You don't tell me about your family." It seemed an irrelevance, but something clicked in Snape's mind. Why did they keep you under the stairs? Weren't there enough bedrooms? There was plenty of room. They just didn't like me very much. I told you. Why don't your family have anything to do with you? Snape shrugged. They don't agree with the decisions I've made. To join Voldemort? Some of them. Or to leave. Potter reached out for Snape's hand. My family and yours sound as if they might get on well together. Just as well we're both away from them. Snape looked down at their joined hands.
Nice.
So at this point, they already have James together.
Yeah, when Dumbledore had them get married, he had them conceive a child, so they were together one time, and it was super awkward and uncomfortable, which I love. So now they have like a 2-year-old, I believe, at this point. He's old enough to talk. One thing I like about this fic, and it's actually one of the first fics I ever read, and it stayed with me because, back then there was not a lot of bottom Snape. Like, if you liked that, you had like 5 fics to choose from. And so even back then, I realized like that was heavily my preference. So that stood out to me, but also just like this fic has a really punchy style that is just kind of, it's giving you straightforward facts without really delving a lot into either of their feelings about any particular situation. But it does it in such a way that I feel like there's a lot of room for you to guess at their feelings. Like the writer gives you just enough information for you to realize that, for instance, Snape cares more for Harry and James, his son, than he lets on. And I really like that.
The whole Potter becomes Harry thing is always like, as far as with Snary, that's always a big thing of when he actually calls him by his first name.
Right.
It's like, yeah, it's like, oh, I've been married for 2 years? Like, yeah, this is Snape and Potter.
Right. A trope as old as the fandom, truly.
Okay. Hey, we're going from, I guess, 2002 to 2005.
Another classic.
Another classic, yeah. This next one, Two-Way Mirror by Icarus, was written shortly after Half-Blood Prince. And I did have a nice little kind of conversation via email with Icarus about this. Can talk more about it afterwards.
Nice.
Sounds good.
Yeah, Two-Way Mirror by Icarus, read by me. Two-Way Mirror by Icarus. It was always the men's room where one heard these things. Percy shook himself off and was buttoning his trousers when the wooden door bumped open. He turned, a bit startled, as 2 men continued their conversation in surprisingly loud voices that echoed off the dank gray walls. Yeah, they've got squibs, girls and boys, who'll suck you for practically free. By their casual robes, they look like they were from the Department of Magical Games and Sports. The bathroom stall thumped closed. The taller of the 2 stood in front of the urinal and said loudly to his friend, "Oh yeah, I've heard of Seven Shoe Alley. Wouldn't be caught dead paying for it, though." Percy hovered by the faucet and pretended to ignore them as he peered at his reflection. He stroked her curl flat with a little water. Everybody does it one time or another. Don't mean nothing about you. It's just that you needed a quick pick-me-up. The other laughed as he buttoned his robes. All the same, I think I'll stick with my girlfriend. Yeah, and how's that working out for you? You find the magic key to unlock her niece yet? Oh, fuck you. It was just the usual crudeness among men, and Percy didn't know why it preyed on his mind throughout the day. Yet he found himself at his desk thinking about it, quill poised as he leaned on an elbow, the late afternoon sun streaming in through the window behind him. There was the usual bustle of people in his office, whose last words he had just missed. The ministers signed the Anti-Dementor Act rider. However, he blinked and tried to catch up. Of course he knew about blowjobs. That was nothing new. He'd even had one once. But somehow blowjob, coupled with boy, had fired his imagination. He wanted that. He wanted to do that. And apparently other people did as well. Fantasies of men's cocks plagued him from that day onward. He had work to do, yet the thought of that warm weight in his mouth. Percy rearranged his robes at a meeting and cleared his throat, his looking around the head, suckling, then swallowing it down. The idea of his lips on a man's dick, he simply could not get it out of his head. He found himself staring inappropriately at some of the men at work. One morning Dawson leaned a hand against Percy's door jamb in a way that was almost enticing. Percy's eyes traveled down his sleek ministry robes, seeking a bulge, wondered how big he was, what he would taste like. Moments later, he realized he'd nodded his head and agreed to organize the department Christmas decorations committee, which he had no time for. But right then, he would have said yes to anything. Another time, he spotted someone particularly attractive walking into the men's room. Dark, longish hair, bright, intense eyes. On a foolish whim, Percy followed him and caught a quick glimpse of a short, surprisingly thick cock that fueled his fantasies for days. But that was dangerous. He carefully avoided the fellow thereafter, just in case he'd noticed his furtive glance. In his flat at night, however, he was free to do as he liked. Tangled naked in his linens, Percy stroked himself and sucked his fingers to approximate what he wanted. He tried various smooth objects, the back end of his wand, a cucumber, the slick round handle of a letter opener that had just the right curve at the end. But no. He sprawled out on his double bed, bare chest rising and falling in the dark, and admitted he had to try it, just to get it out of his system. He was a practical man, and at least he knew exactly what he wanted. Just the once. But somehow, deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be only one time. The long wooden fence that lined the entrance to Seven Shoe Alley blinked with wanted posters of various Death Eaters, just like everywhere else in Wizarding London these days. Wrappers from various unsavory items blew along the ground as Percy wrapped himself more firmly in his cloak, stepping around abandoned corks that rolled a bit in the breeze. The posters didn't seem to affect business here. There's a surprisingly long line outside a place called the Banana Club, and laughter poured out of an establishment next door that had a sign depicting a crude line drawing of a centaur. It shifted, then displayed the picture of a very endowed centaur. Percy stared. This appeared to be the right place. The windowless outer wall of the naked centaur had a line of posters, all featuring this piercing glare of Severus Snape. Listen to the reward money for his capture. He looked the same as when he was Percy's professor, if slightly more bored. It was under those calm, hardly blinking eyes that Percy stopped a young man in a kilt and revealing sleeveless vest to ask a few questions. The young man turned him down, to Percy's complete mortification, but breezily sent him along to another who did, in fact, do men. His face burning, Percy decided Seven Shoe Alley had probably seen everything, hopefully, which made it not one whit less embarrassing. The man turned out to be a blackfellow who was probably a squib. Staring at his shoes, Percy arranged a price of 11 galleons, then rented a cheap hotel for an hour. The room had only a bed that took the entire space and smelled like spilled beer as Percy laid back on it, watching the man undo his belt. He had a very large cock. He taught Percy exactly how to suck him, how to circle his hand around the base and pump. How it quickly became apparent Percy would never be able to take in more than a little. Percy sucked and licked, gasping, and his arse burned. Finally, he asked the prostitute if he'd fuck him. The man went very slow, his arm wrapped around Percy's waist. Percy was unable to relax enough and couldn't get it in the first time. But in later visits, he grew much better. Percy was always careful to only visit during the week, with the slightly paranoid notion he might run into those two from the ministry bathroom on the busy Saturdays. At times, his new schedule would strike him suddenly as odd. Read the Daily Prophet, scanning for names he might know in the latest Death Eater texts. Apparate to his conservative position at the ministry. Return home to change his clothing. Then apparate to a dirty street corner to follow a man into a hotel room and find himself with his knees pressed back around his ears, though cocksucking remained his favorite activity. One day his regular trick wasn't at his corner, simply packed up and gone. Percy never knew if he'd been arrested or killed by the followers of you-know-who, or had perhaps gone on to a better life. He privately hoped for the latter. But by then, Percy had learned of other possibilities that weren't quite as expensive. They lacked the original intimacy of his regular date. But he discovered that, unlike witches, wizards were quite available for anonymous encounters for free. Stepping into a dim bookstore that advertised a variety of short-term engorgement charms, Percy pretended to examine the shelves until the coast was clear. Head down, not making eye contact with the clerk, he paid at the front counter and was handed the overlarge counter charm key that unlocked the booth. He crossed to the back of the store and pulled back the faded blue curtain. There he disapparated, feeling the sickening jolt as his destination apparated elsewhere with him. It was magically foolhardy. Splinching was the least of one's worries, but utterly secure. 2 booths, commonly called shakers, apparated from random locations. They required no flu connection, so were as untraceable as personal apparition. Not only did the other person not know who Percy was, it was impossible to know where he was either. Inside there was nothing but a tiny room with a bench, and a long oblong hole little wider than one's face between the 2 boxes. Slightly dizzy, Percy put his hand on the wall and sat down. The room had a heady sort of quiet that was filled with the presence of another wizard. The other box had already arrived. The man sat on his bench on the other side of the wall, his knees visible through the hole, hands folded politely in his lap. He sniffed a little, like he had a cold. So he was human. Probably. Percy smiled tentatively as a matter of courtesy to prove he didn't have vampire incisors or the like. There was always a slight thrill of fear in these silent negotiations. The other man didn't lean forward to peer through or smile in return. He wore thick dark robes, as black as a Deventer's, and his face was hidden in a deep cowl. Vampire, then. No, thank you. Percy stood and started to disapparate. Wait. Percy froze. He knew that voice. A sudden chill creeped down his neck. Professor Snape. He recalled that main Aura liaison in the criminal division was Dawlish, though certainly any Aura on duty would take the report, turning him in. Percy worried about what this would tell them of his proclivities given the location, and he hated to think what it might do to his career, but he stopped. He had no idea where Snape was. There was no way to tell. The Auras could search every apparition box in the country, provided they knew where they all were, and Snape would be long gone. And Percy was so far from a duelist, he hadn't even considered Expelliarmus until just this moment. Not that it would do any good. He chewed his lip. Snape was as secure as Percy for the exact same reasons. The man who killed Dumbledore. The worst criminal since you-know-who. His hand still on the wall, Percy stayed. He didn't know why. Perhaps he was lonely and this was the first familiar voice in this new world of his. Perhaps he didn't want to run. Perhaps he wanted to talk to him, ask him why. Or perhaps it was that note in Snape's voice that said please, in a way notorious criminals weren't supposed to. Something was certainly off. They were silent a long time. Snape spoke. I didn't know you did this, that you were... He trailed off. I didn't know either, Percy answered in all honesty. They weren't supposed to speak, but they had already broken that rule. It does make sense, however, when I think back. It didn't to Percy, but he wasn't going to argue. He leaned his forearm against the wall between them, burying his forehead in his elbow. He clenched his fist. Why? The tears were there for Dumbledore. Percy had never shed them and wasn't planning to now. The room went still. Snape took a long breath and said cautiously, It could not have happened any other way. Which didn't make any sense either. Snape was speaking in riddles. Percy tried to get angry, and he was angry for an instant, but instead just felt empty. Snape's voice was muffled as if buried in fabric as well. "At least let me see you," he asked. Percy knelt on the grimy floor, hoping Snape would do the same. There was still a part of him that didn't believe this, and he needed to see. "You're beautiful," Snape said softly, his voice a caress. Percy brightened a tad at the compliment, no matter the source. He glanced up from the floor and saw that Snape had knelt as well, and had lowered his cowl. He had never been a handsome man, but now he looked nothing like Percy remembered. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and his cheeks were sunken, eyes lined and aged. His black hair was straw-like and dull. He looked more the role of the hunted criminal than the master spy of the Death Eaters. He seemed so impossibly thin. "Are you getting enough to eat?" Percy couldn't help but ask. "Going to invite me over for tea, are you?" Wry, gallows humor. Funny Percy had never been able to recognize it in school, though there was a lot of it around these days. "Well, the kettle's always on," Percy tried to say it lightly. It was a weak joke, but Snape made a sound that was somewhere between a chuckle and a cough. Percy had never heard Professor Snape laugh before. Professor Snape breathed a sigh and reached his hand through the hole. Percy pulled back for a moment, because this just wasn't done. These sorts of encounters weren't like that, but they were far beyond the rules now. He let Snape touch his face, delicately, almost reverently, stroking along Percy's jawline. Percy studied his long fingers, the cracked nails as they moved, his breath quickening. He looked up into Snape's burning eyes as he withdrew his hand and wanted to kiss him. And so he did, hot, with a great deal of fire and an unnecessary amount of teeth, chin pressed against where they were separated by the wall. The wall stopped Percy's arm where he tried to reach and grasp Snape's shoulder, his palm pressed flat, the hard edge of the wood denting his face where it crammed against his cheek. They broke apart, giving up, shuddering and shaken. Snape stood, strangely looking almost schoolboy shy as he unbuttoned and parted his robes. And Percy did it. Snape's long, uncut cock pressed through that hole, curving down, thick dark hair at its base. Percy reached through and palmed his bare hip, his skin unaccountably smooth, as he lovingly sucked Snape's cock, tongues trailing down the shaft, swallowing the small head. He grasped Snape around the base and stroked, feeling him lean against the wall with an inarticulate sound. Then he let his hand slide down Snape's thigh to cup and fondle his balls, one finger sliding up his perineum. Heard him gasp on the other side of the wall, thrusting into Percy's mouth, slightly out of control. There was the scrabble of nails against wood that Percy wanted on his skin, hot and intense. And Snape came with a long shuddering groan, slumping against the wall. As he swallowed, Percy worried if this was quite healthy for Snape, and what to do if he collapsed. They didn't say anything more, though Snape returned the favor, which was unexpected. They adjusted their clothes, buttoning trousers and clothes in a near-silent shift of fabric. Then Percy waited for Snape to depart. But Snape remained, his steady eyes on Percy, who felt curiously vulnerable and naked under that gaze, like a flu call, where neither could end the conversation. They just stood there, wordless. Finally, Percy made a decision and disapparated. For a long time afterward, Percy was disgusted and angry with himself. What sort of weak worm had he become, getting on his knees? He fantasized about firing spells through that hole, and apprehending Snape himself, or else telling him off in long, well-crafted, scathing speeches about all that he had done to the wizarding world. At other times, Percy worried about him turning up in a ditch somewhere, died of starvation, or worse, and wondered how he was, wishing him well, if unsuccessful in his criminal aims. He never reported it. Other than exposing himself, what good would it do? The wanted posters everywhere haunted Percy, Snape blinking at him from every corner, reminding him. Finally, Percy commandeered one from the ministry and hung it up in his room. Somehow then he felt better, though who could say why? He did go back there from time to time, disapparating when the person on the other side didn't have dark robes and longish black hair. But for the most part, Percy stopped his nocturnal ventures, telling himself he needed to concentrate on his work. In truth, he fantasized about that encounter almost exclusively now, and knew that whatever followed wouldn't measure up, although the sex hadn't been all that good. Snape had come too quickly, and then there'd been that wall. But at night, in Percy's fantasies, there would come a knock at his door. There was no war, and no one to blame for it. And each time, a low, dark voice tinged with mockery would say, as he opened it, "I thought I might drop by for tea."
Oh, Percy.
That was fantastic.
Mhm.
I don't think I've ever read a Snape and Percy fic, but I really like that.
Yeah. Actually, Icarus said that they thought they were a Snape author. They ended up writing more stories about Percy because he was getting hate,
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
and has actually written a whole cycle of Percy fics, and some are with Snape and
hmm
with other characters. They're all very good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I will have to check them out.
Yeah. Okay, Icarus says, there was a game I used to play reading early fic. Guess the canon. Snape was usually the giveaway. If the Snape was dark and with an out-of-control temper, it was post-Preserve Azkaban. If Snape were thoughtful and dangerous with Harry's best interests at heart, it was post-Goblet of Fire. If Snape were resentful, secretive, and very much the master spy, it was post-Order of the Phoenix. If Snape is either irredeemable or redeemed, it was post-Half-Blood Prince. And if Snape's decisions were informed by his Marauder era past, it was post-Deathly Hallows.
Huh.
That's interesting, and I definitely see what they mean, because the tone of fan fiction definitely changed over the years as the books came out. And then, since it's been so many years since Deathly Hallows came out, now I feel like the diversity of how Snape is written has just increased even more.
Oh, yeah.
And I was thinking about this the other day, actually, because I see people say, like, oh, this is OOC or whatever about, various fics. The funny thing about Snape is that his characterization is so different in the books and the movies that he kind of runs the gambit of characterization.
Yes. Yes, that's true. And I don't know, I always kind of question when people put him in a box of behaving only a certain way.
Mhm.
Right.
Definitely.
And that's something I liked about this fic. For as much as you're seeing it through Percy's point of view, and Percy's looking at Snape as the person who killed Dumbledore, the reason for the war and all of that, even Percy can't help but see how vulnerable he is
Yeah.
and worries about him.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
It's kind of Molly creeping in there.
That's true. I didn't think about that.
Are you eating enough?
Right. Fantasizing about giving him tea.
Icarus also says, Two-Way Mirror is one story where the context of the rest of canon actually changed how the story was perceived. People who read it after a Half-Blood Prince and before DH read a story about a war criminal who'd killed Dumbledore. It was an uncomfortable story back then because it doesn't redeem him, but it doesn't condemn him either.
I like that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, now that we look at it, we it's like, well, he really was good.
Yeah, and I remember that time. I don't think about it now, but I remember that time, before Deathly Hallows, and I think that's kind of the seed of where a lot of the people who are Snape haters,
Mm-hmm.
they don't understand what we like about the character and why we want to write about him. But I think, even if all of that were true, even if he had never been revealed as a spy or redeemed by the narrative, I don't think there's anything wrong with writing a bad fictional character.
Absolutely.
I think that's something. I wish that were something that more people were comfortable with and didn't act like it was some sort of moral failing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I know.
So I appreciate those brave souls who were still writing Snape during that period.
Yes. Okay. And we have one more story, a little bit of PWP. It's called A Fortuitous Accident by arabellawrites, and it's read by InspiraPens.
What ship?
Oh, it's SSHG.
Okay.
A Fortuitous Accident by arabellawrites. Morgana's fucking tits. Severus fell through the doorway of his quarters with Hermione on his heels. Severus! Caked dirt fell everywhere as they rapidly yanked off their outer layers, scrambling to distance themselves from the tainted clothes. This is hardly the time to be vexed with my language, which, if we don't get this dragon's venom off us quickly, we're going to be suffering far worse than your delicate ears. Hermione huffed. I said I was sorry. It is rule number 1, Miss Granger. His coat finally unbuttoned. He threw it to the floor and vanished it with a flourish. You do not take samples of Peruvian viper saliva from a mother's nest. Ever. Hermione threw her cardigan onto the floor and watched as Severus vanished that too, her hands making quick work of the laces on her shoes. I told you, I didn't see that it was a nest. A frustrated noise rumbled through his chest, breaking through his composure. Teeth clenched together, he said, which is precisely why apprentices do not typically assist with ingredient collection in dangerous environments. Spare me the lecture, please. My skin is on fire. We have to shower this off quickly, or we're not going to have any skin left, Severus retorted. Shit. Hermione froze, her eyes darting to the flue. Is your flue open? I can't get back to my rooms like this. Of course not. Why would I want to allow anyone the ability to traipse into my private quarters? His fingers froze on his shirt buttons as he realized their predicament. Fucking Merlin. He pointed to the lavatory. Shower. Quickly. She thought for only a second before quickly discarding her shirt and working on the buttons of her skirt. There's no time. Miss Granger, he turned sharply on his heels, facing away from her as she continued to undress. She tutted. Don't be a prude, Severus. There's no time for us to do this separately. Do you see how much hair is on my head? It would take me at least 20 minutes, and by the time I'm done, you'd be reduced to a raw pile of flesh. What are you suggesting exactly? He bit out as his fingers worked his buttons, still facing away from her. There's only one shower, she stated clearly. Therefore, we have to do this together. Miss Granger? Fine, suit yourself, but I don't know any healing spells for the skin that melts off your body, do you? He growled before discarding his shirt and unbuttoning his trousers. I'll meet you in there, she said, running to the lavatory in just her undergarments before he could reply. Despite her brave words and desperate need to not be skinless, she still felt a little shy. Hermione vanished her remaining clothes and climbed into the shower, sighing as the water rinsed the toxic venom off her skin. She heard his feet pad on the floor outside the curtains as he approached, and suspected he was walking heavier than usual, so as not to startle her. Are you finished? She laughed. Hardly, but it's better. Just get in, Severus. I don't want to have to go to Azkaban for the rest of my life for killing my potions master. She heard, rather than saw him, roll his eyes, with an exasperated sigh as he pulled the curtain back and stepped in. Keeping her back to him while remaining under the water, Hermione was suddenly acutely aware of her nakedness. There was a small gasp as he took her in, before turning to face the wall. The echo gave him away. Oh, so he liked her arse. Good to know. Okay, let's swap so you can wash off, she said. She held her arms in front of her chest and moved around to one side of the shower, so that they had effectively switched places while remaining back to back. Severus exhaled with relief as she had, just when the water rinsed the caustic liquid from his skin. Hermione tried to keep her eyes trained on the wall. Can you pass me the shampoo, please? You'll smell like me, he protested. Yes, well, I don't have any here, so it appears my options are rather limited at the moment. She heard him attempt to control another sigh in the midst of their unorthodox predicament, and a moment later he pressed a bottle into her hand, still facing away. Thank you. She lathered her hair with his shampoo, the scent of juniper berries and pine enveloping her. He was right. She did indeed smell like him. That thought sent a wave of heat straight to her core, and she felt her cheeks tinge pink. There was no reason to be unprofessional about this, she chided herself. Her long-time schoolgirl fascination with the surly potions master was just that, a fantasy, nothing more. She could be mature even if she did smell just like him while standing naked in his shower, a foot away from his. She rubbed the soap harshly through her hair and then winced in pain. "Ah! What is it?" he said, instinctively turning to look. She tried her hardest to keep her eyes from drifting down his half-turned body. "I think a patch of skin burned under my hair on my neck." Severus turned fully toward her now, moving her hair to examine the spot. Hermione waited, stark naked and wet, with her mentor's hands on her neck and in her hair. He seemed completely unbothered by her state of undress, in the face of danger to her person. His fingers touched the spot that hurt, and while it did fucking hurt, she never had his hands on such an intimate part of her skin before. She slowly exhaled, willing her traitorous body to calm down. She knew that he was only doing his job as her employer, making sure she was okay, but she wished he were as affected as his presence was making her. "It is burned, but it's not too large a spot. I should be able to heal it." He reached out of the shower to grab his wand before singing the incantation over her neck in a low, gravelly voice. Hermione felt an involuntary shiver go through her at the sound of his voice. A small moan escaped her throat. His hands froze. "Miss Granger?" Mortification flooded through her body, and she stared intensely at the crack in the tile before her. "I'm sorry, your voice is just very nice. It was soothing. It's nothing. Sorry. Thank you." She moved further away into the stream of water to rinse out the rest of her hair, still with her back to him. The seconds stretched on, and Hermione wasn't sure if the heat in her face would ever abate beneath the hot water, but at least this way he could not see her embarrassment. She heard Severus place his wand down again, finally, and his arm reached past her to grab the bar of soap on the ledge. Remaining under the stream, she willed it to wash away the shame and self-consciousness she felt, grateful for the water to hide the patch of wetness collecting between her legs. She had always loved his voice, but she didn't think that she would be so affected by his naked proximity. She'd been serious that they just need to get the poisonous solution off their skin. It wasn't a rouse, but the best laid plans, as they say. Hermione felt his eyes on her arse, the way one knows when someone is watching them from across a room. Tilting her head to the side under the guise of washing the soap from her curls, she used her hair as a curtain to peek back at him. He was hard. Oh, gods. Thankful for the mess of hair, hiding her widening eyes from his notice, she watched as he lathered soap between his hands and rubbed it along his chest, his stomach, down. She quickly ducked the rest of her head under the water, not willing to get caught staring at him as he ran his hands over his cock. Severus cleared his throat roughly. "I should rinse this off, Miss Granger." She pulled back from the water quickly. "Oh yes, of course. Sorry." And she stepped further toward the front wall of the shower to give him access to the water. Realizing a moment too late, she had trapped herself between him and the wall with only a few inches of space on either side. She tucked her arms across her chest and bravely turned to face him. "Do you have conditioner?" she asked. He nodded slowly. Their eyes locked together, both fixedly not looking down, and reached above her head to pull down a bottle from its slot on the wall. "Would you—" he began and then stopped. She raised a brow. "Yes?" "Do you require assistance?" She tried to rein in her surprise, lest the delicate balance be broken. With a measured breath, Hermione boldly dropped her arms so her breasts were completely visible to him, and watched as he glanced down for only a second before swallowing, the neutral mask on his face still in place. Was it an invitation? She certainly didn't need help washing her own hair, but he had asked to touch her, and she wanted to feel those hands on her again. "Yes, please." He poured the conditioner into his hand and replaced the bottle on the shelf. She stepped alongside him. There was more room to work with if she stood at the back of the shower, and then pushed her hair over her shoulders. His fingers were in her hair and on her scalp, massaging her head within seconds. Hermione braced her hands against the wall for stability and let her mouth fall open under his menstruations. Fuck, did it feel good to have his hands so embedded into her curls. He wasn't rough or perfunctory. Instead, he seemed to be caressing her with intention through the actions. After a minute of this, she steeled herself. Be brave, Hermione. The worst he can do is hex you, and then you'll just have to obliviate yourself. No problem. Severus, she asked, barely more than a whisper. His hands paused where they were, and there was a delay before he answered. Yes? Without turning, she raised her hands to his own and took them in hers, sliding them down her neck, shoulders, and round the front of her chest, just above her breasts, and stopped. She'd placed him on her skin, let him know she wanted his touch, and the rest would be up to him. She felt him step forward, hands still hovering above her soft chest, just above the line of impropriety, as if standing naked with your apprentice in the shower were not already leaps and bounds past that boundary. Are you sure? His voice was hesitant, barely more than a whisper. Her heart rate kicked into double speed. He wanted it. He wanted it. Yes. Severus was on her immediately, hands cupping her breasts, body pressed flush against her back. She could feel his hard length against her bum as he pressed her forward into the wall. His mouth descended along her jaw, moving along the column of her neck as he nipped and kissed it affectionately. This time she didn't bother to hide the sounds he evoked from her. He stepped just off center so that his cock rested by her hip, and he thrust forward. She felt the skin along his length rolling against her as she pressed forward and dropped her hand immediately to stroke him. He groaned, sucking at the spot beneath her ear, still pushing in and out of her small hand. She rolled her thumb over the head, and he sucked in a breath. Hermione. She mewed, kneeling under his touch, and pushed her arse back toward him. His fingers trailed down her spine, over her bum, and found her center. Delirious with the dizzying knowledge that her potion master's fingers were circling her core, she panted, trying to gain enough breath not to pass out. He slipped one long, dexterous finger inside her, rubbing along her front wall, hooking her body into his palm. Fuck. Language, Miss Granger, he drawled. Hermione blushed furiously as he pumped one finger slowly in and out of her, her hands against the wall, cheek pressed against the cool tiles. The longer he continued his slow manipulation of her most sensitive spots, the harder she breathed, spots in her vision as he deftly maneuvered her closer to the edge. Please, she begged. Are you going to come for me, Hermione? He whispered in his silky, deep voice, his mouth pressed against the shell of her ear. Are you going to give me all your pleasure? Yes, yes, yes. She was so close, so close. He grabbed her by the hips, turning her around in one fluid motion as he lifted her and pressed her back against the wall. She wrapped her legs around his waist, impressed and even more turned on by the display of strength. He kissed her soundly, and her mind went blank. You are an intoxicating tease, he whispered against her mouth between explorations. Her? She had been so close. If anything, he was the tease. She tilted her face up more, wanting his lips along her jaw. I'm not a tease. I want you. I have wanted you for far too long. He smiled against her mouth. It is mutual, witch. Her lips molded to his, and she tasted the hint of chamomile and mint from his tea. She broke apart from him only to lean in and whisper, Please, Severus. It was all the encouragement he needed. He shifted her against the wall and lowered her onto his cock, sliding in easily with her arousal. The stretch was immaculate. She gazed into his dark eyes as she felt him bottom out inside her, both of them breathing rapidly. There was no going back now. Moves, she breathed, and he did, but oh so slowly, quirking an eyebrow at her with a smug grin, reminding her that he was totally in control. The drag along her walls was the most perfect friction, and he slowly drove her higher, grinding perfectly against her favorite spot. Her arms never left his neck. Her mouth parted as he watched her eyes on every stroke. Her curls hung wet around her shoulders, her mind blank. There was nothing but the pleasure he was giving her. "You are divine," he breathed, punctuating each word with a roll of his hips. Hermione moaned, words beyond her as she accepted every stroke and touch. He nipped at her lower lip, eliciting more sounds of pure delight. "And I want to feel you fall apart around me." Her eyes rolled back as he shifted his weight, using one hand to reach his thumb across her middle and rub her clit while he rocked into her. Fuck, fuck, fuck. She was done for. Hermione shattered around him, vision too bright, each repeating pulsation magnified by his continued movement. "Severus," she cried, head thrown back against the tiles. "Hermione, gods!" And she could feel him filling her, the total lack of anything between them in that moment of pure connection, prolonging her climax. Her body squeezed his and he held deep within her. Eyes locked on hers as they both slowly regained their breath. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she slid a fraction down the wall. She giggled and was pleased to see an answering smile on his lips. "I never thought you the type to seduce your employer," he said with a grin. "I never thought you the type to be seduced," she replied, matching his smirk. "I suppose we were both pleasantly surprised by the turn of events, then." He squeezed her bum, where he held her up against the wall. "I'm not complaining. Nor am I." "My legs are getting a bit tired, though," she said apologetically, sliding another inch down the wall. "Of course," he said, lowering her gently. "You should lie down and rest after such a trying day. The bed would be the most comfortable place to regain your strength." "Oh, the bed?" A grin stretched across her cheeks. "I'd love to see it. After I get this conditioner out," she said with a blissed-out grin. He snorted, pulling her to his chest under the stream, the warm water enveloping them as they clung to one another in newfound joy, every touch so novel that her heart and skin sang. A smile pulled at her lips, and she wondered what they might discover about each other on his bed. She felt sure he would let her stay the night after such exhaustive research. She was too tired to return to her own quarters. After all, there was only one bed.
Oh, jeez. That was funny.
So, yes, a twist on the only one bed theme.
It's like when they say the title of the movie in the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that it's like we have to take our clothes off. Like there's
We
no getting
have
around this.
to.
Our skin is going to burn off.
It'll melt off.
Exactly. I'm like, do you know a spell? It's like, yeah, it's just oh my gosh, it's so funny.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so good. I wish Arabella was still with us, but
Yeah.
Anyway, so I always thought that sex was sort of, I don't know. It was like, man, they always do that in Britain.
Certainly in fan fiction, at least.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff in fanfic that it's like in real life practice, you're like, that has to be not fun or painful or like
right.
in a way of like, it's like, okay, but when it's all, fantasy, it's like, oh yeah, I'm not gonna think about the specifics and the actual like practical application of things.
It's the beauty of fiction. Physics doesn't matter.
Literally. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't remember who it was, but an author recently told me that they used action figures when they were writing their.
That's fantastic. I actually, that makes me think I have these little like figures that are for artists.
Like
for
I was gonna say, like the art, yeah,
right?
Like model things.
Oh, yeah.
I have some Japanese ones called Body-kun and Body-chan that are like way better than the wooden models or whatever.
Yes,
I'm gonna have to use these for like coming up with fan fiction scenes.
That's hilarious. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, well, that makes sense because, I mean, there's a lot of spatialness going on, even though physics doesn't matter.
Yeah, you want it to make sense enough so that the reader understands what's happening. Because I know I've read fan fictions where I'm just like, where are they? What are they doing?
Yeah.
Are they floating in air?
Yeah.
Oh, Snape can fly.
Right.
What if?
Her leg is where and how? Oh, well, we got so many different flavors of Snape today. We got
We really did.
Yeah.
grumpy yet, dad that is still gonna give you a nice nutritious meal, and freaking out at gunpoint, and
Uh-huh.
just, oh,
I actually, when we were talking about this episode coming up, I knew it wasn't a requirement, but the fact that it's his birthday episode, that's what made me think of that fic, is it's the one fic that I know that explicitly references his birthday.
Mhm. Yeah. Actually, there is one scene in Year of the Thestral that he goes through a scene with Minerva and then says, yes, this was my birthday present to me.
Oh, huh.
Because I think she didn't actually know when his birthday was in that
Right.
in that setting. But
Minerva.
yeah, you work with somebody for 17 years or whatever it was.
Never know his birthday.
Yeah.
Wasn't it? It's still over like break and stuff, isn't it? Like it's still like over the halls, like the holiday break.
Speaking as somebody with a birthday very close to his, my birthday's 2 days before his, and all through my childhood growing up, very frequently my birthday would be the first day back at school, and it sucked.
Oh, yeah.
And I can only imagine that Snape would be experiencing a similar thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, my birthday's September 1st, so
Oh no. Like, it's my birthday, time to go back to work.
yeah, I know. Like that was always around the Labor Day weekend or whatever when we would go back to school, and I'm like, oh yeah, my birthday's coming up. That sounds terrible. I'm like, it's the end
No.
of summer. Yeah.
Well, and an early January birthday also means that it's right after Christmas, so like nobody wants to give you presents.
Gifts again. I know. I
Oh,
know.
yeah.
You got to do half birthday parties.
Yeah, I need to.
Mhm.
I need to. Snape needs to. Just
Yes.
people start showing up randomly in July giving him presents.
Yeah.
And that's the best when I think of his birthday is, of course, he's not going to tell anybody like when it is. He's not going to celebrate it in any sort of way. But when someone figures it out and then he starts receiving gifts or they like throw him a party or things like that, like that just is just the funniest and the best thing that could happen to him, even though he's going to act like he hates it. But really it's like, oh, I've never had anyone,
Right.
do anything like this for me. And
Mhm.
just be all grumpy about it, but really be very like,
Mhm.
feeling very touched in the way that Severus can be touched.
And he can be touched.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Yes, as many orgasms as possible. That's the gift that keeps on giving.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining me.
Mhm.
Megs.
This was fun. Thanks to all our writers and the readers for getting these together. So it's nice. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And Masao.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It was a lot of fun. Glad to celebrate Snape's birthday with y'all.
Mm-hmm.
All righty. Well, everybody have a good one.
You too.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
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 Thanks to Megs, Masao, and arabellawrites for joining the listening party. Thanks to paracosim and perverse idol for reading your stories. Thanks also to Arrisha, senlinyu, Icarus, and arabellawrites for permission to feature their fics. And thanks to Pirup, Snape Snail Tape, Masao, and Inspire Pens for their awesome readings. Check out our additional reading page at snapechatpodcast.com for links to all these amazing stories and more. And here we must say goodbye. We wish we didn't have to, but it hasn't escaped our notice that life isn't fair. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Tumblr and Twitter. Leave a comment on our website, snapechatpodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Many thanks to Nix for continued work on our website. Support us on Ko-fi to help defray the cost of production. That's ko-fi.com. Be sure to check out Kara Magical Shippers podcast and alwayssnape.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay snarky.